I decided to go for a lovely solo hike and camping trip in the Appalachian Trails. Well, not on the trails, but just off the sides of them. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in doing so, and I'd planned to be out there for about a week. I obviously had quite a lot of supplies with me, and I'd gone to an old military surplus to get one of those big rocks that the soldiers use. These things are extremely good, and it managed to get me really good stoves and other things while I was in the shop, so I was pretty happy. They basically gave me some little white cubes that you could light with a lighter, and they would burn for ages and you could do some food. I had lots of canned food with me, and I didn't carry too much because I was worried about becoming overcumbered and not being able to move much. Now, on about the fourth day of my hike, I hadn't encountered too many other people. There was actually one or two runners, which I thought was pretty weird because I couldn't figure out where they'd come from because I was now pretty deep in, but we always said a friendly hello. Some of them would opt to stop and chat for a while, and I actually enjoyed this. A lot of them told me that they couldn't really see me because of the camouflage in my backpack, and I thought that was pretty cool. I also had a raincoat which was camouflage, which is important to remember for later on in the story. Now, I eventually say goodbye to the couple of joggers that I encounter and say that I need to keep moving to get to the next post to set up camp, and everything's as it should be. For whatever reason, I wasn't feeling that great on this particular part of my journey. I don't think I was unwell, but just something on my body felt off. Every so often I would get like a sharp pain in my head that kind of felt like someone was stabbing the back of it. I was worried that a tick or something was biting me, but when I checked with my phone and mirror, there was nothing there. I actually had chicken pox when I was younger, and I still had some scars from it, so I was pretty convinced that this was the issue. So I continue on my hike. Now again, the scenery is really nice, but I suppose that's what you expect in places like this. I'd gone on a number of solo trips before, but I was starting to think that maybe I preferred being with other people out here. The only problem was I didn't really have that many friends that are experienced enough to go with me. A lot of my friends would say, yeah, let's do this and this, and that I'm trained and I know what I'm doing, but when we actually got out there, I pretty much had to babysit them the whole way through. This can be very annoying because you end up basically teaching the whole time, and they always seem to do something wrong. I had one friend that didn't have appropriate footwear and they got these terrible blisters, and I pretty much had to carry them for half of the trek, which really exhausted me. If any of you are going to go hiking in the future or camping, just please make sure that you have the correct shoes because you don't want to be playing games with your feet out here. It turned out that my friend actually got his foot wet and had an issue with some early onset of gangrene, and it was pretty nasty. You can imagine the smell too. I won't describe it here because it makes me feel a bit sick, but anyway. Those were my thoughts at the time. I was pretty relaxed now, and I start to feel a bit better as I get more into the sun. Eventually I have to stop because I need to urinate, and I do so. About halfway through, I have a strange sensation that something's about to happen. Weirdly, I'm pretty much always spot on when these things happen. As I know, I've had it a few times where I've gone onto a train quite late at night and had a weird feeling, and then some lunatic comes up to me. I think this has happened 3 or 4 times now, and I'm actually convinced I'm a little bit psychic to these things, but that was what I was thinking. Okay, maybe there's somebody about to creep up on me. So I stop and look around, and I don't see anyone. I decide to be a bit more brave now and actually call out hello, even louder this time, but I just hear my voice echoing in the distance. I go to turn and I hear a hissing sound, and I see something that freezes me to the spot. Probably not 2 foot in front of me is a very large brown snake. I think it was brown, but I couldn't really see because it was well camouflaged. And what's worse is I've just urinated on its head pretty much. It hasn't moved, but I can see it moving slowly, and I don't know what to do. I'm pretty sure I've at least offended this thing or annoyed it, because, I mean, who wants to have that happen to them? I count my breaths and try my best to calm myself down because I'm really starting to panic. I always thought I was somebody who was good at not overreacting to things, but there have been a few situations where I have, and this was one of them. I take one step back, then another, and another, and I slowly get away from this thing, and I start to hear my breath normalize a bit. I don't take my eyes off of this thing, and I slowly make my way back to my pack. I quickly grab it and do not take my eyes off this thing as I slowly make my way round the bend. What's worse, as I do so I notice another one not far off from it. I don't know if they were partners or if it was its mate, but it was almost like I went into a little snake den, urinated on them and didn't realise. Now this snake was pretty big. I can't really say how big it is because I was so singularly fixated on it that I couldn't get a size of it, but it would have had to have been about 3 feet or so long, maybe more. And not really what you want out here. That's a pretty good ticket to death. With my hands sweaty, I go to check the time on my phone so I know how much further I have to hike. I realise I haven't got signal here, and that really scares me. If that thing had bit me, then I don't really know what I would have done. I had a backup satellite phone and even that wasn't connecting because of the tree density. I actually dwell on this for quite a long time, and I tell myself that I have to be more careful. I jokingly say, "Sorry, Mr. Snakes, I have done something terrible today," and I slowly make my way through a clearing. Now, while doing so, I don't really feel settled. I'm not somebody who's ever experienced shock or anything. I had a pretty scary experience once where I got robbed, and one of my friends said, "Oh, you must be in shock," but I just wasn't. I just didn't care much. I was of course shook, but not too badly. But this felt different. My hands are quite sweaty, but I keep having this pounding feeling in my head. It's almost like something's terribly wrong. I get worried that maybe I've got some kind of cut or something, but every time I check I'm fine, and I keep putting it down to nerves attached to scar tissue from the time that I had smallpox as a child. But again, there's not really too much to suggest that this is the case, because every time I check I'm clear. Now eventually I make it up to my camping site and I'm really happy to get rested. I had a pretty long day, and it was enough to make me not enjoy my trip so much. I encountered a couple of friendly hikers, but from that point on, something just felt really off. So I eventually take my shoes off, put my socks on, the comfy ones that I have, and I just relax a bit. I start reading a book, and again I didn't really feel much of anything, but I realise I'm extremely tired now. It's kind of like dusky dawn. I don't know how you describe it, but when the sky is red but about to be nighttime, and I settle in. I didn't set up a fire though because it was warm enough not to need one, and I didn't want to cause too many issues here. I settle into my sleeping bag and I fall into a very deep sleep. Now, when I fall asleep, it's almost like I've been transported into another world. I open my eyes and I'm in a forest, just like the one that I was actually in. It's weird because I understood the similarity even though I was dozed off. I can see trees literally all around me, and there's something weird about this. Everything's just a little bit more red and dark than it should be. I wasn't actually sure I was dreaming at some points because how vivid it was, and I open up the tent door and step outside, really taking a good look at everything. Now, my tent looks completely different when I step out of it and I turn around and the thing's gone. There's also this weird deep bassy sound that's constantly following a rhythmic pattern in the background. It kind of sounds like if you're about to load a scary game and you know you've got some loading screen ambient sounds. Yeah, it's pretty much just like this. It was pretty worrying though for me because I've never experienced anything like it. I actually try and hit myself in the dream wondering if I'm actually asleep or not, but it doesn't make a difference. I look as far as I can and the trees seem to expand for miles and miles, and that's when I see it. only for a second, but something which I can only describe as being similar to the Grim Reaper suddenly appears in front of me. This thing is extremely tall, like maybe 10 feet tall, dressed in this very dark robe, with some kind of red dripping off of it staring down at me. Now it doesn't make a sound, but it's there for a second and it knows I can see it, and then it flashes away. I'm obviously pretty freaked out by this, and I can still hear the sounds increasing of this low rhythmic music, and I start to go further now. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of the back rooms, but it really feels like I'm in one of those. I ended up jogging, but every time I'm jogging, the horizon just seems to reset almost, like it's spawning in every so often. Like, I'm almost a hamster running in a treadmill on a simulation. I'm not really going anywhere. I can't find my tent, and I can hear taps every so often. It kind of sounds like somebody's throwing a stone in a large room, and it really creeps me out. I don't know what that thing is, and the further I go, the more sly I seem to be getting. Now, I become very sweaty at this point. I now look down towards my feet, and I feel like there's something wrong with the ground also. It really looks like it's almost melting. It's hard to describe, but you know when you see a heat wave, it's kind of like I'm staring at one of those, but I'm not. This is just normal. I actually start to scream out and become very anxious, but no sounds come out. I then eventually find what appears to be a way out of the woods, as they all seem to go off into one direction and one path finally. I start sprinting towards it. Now, I was probably sprinting towards this for a good 10 or so minutes before eventually slowing down. I turn back to look behind myself and I don't see anything. I turn back again and there's just trees upon trees. I don't seem to be getting much closer. I decide to make one last dash for it, and I sprint even quicker this time. I'm becoming aware of how hot I feel and how that everything feels different. Now, I eventually make it to the end, and just as I take one step towards what appears to be light, that thing appears again, this time standing dead in front of me like a guardian to the gates of hell. And then I snap out of it. I scream, and I'm suddenly back in my tent. I start feeling around to make sure that it's real and pinch myself, and I'm definitely awake now. I'm absolutely drenched in sweat and covered in some kind of weird liquid. It's almost got like a yellowy colour to it. I mean, it's not urine or anything that the snakes handed back to me, but it's definitely weird. It's almost like a glazing over my skin. I peel open the tent very slowly, scared that I'm gonna be there still, but luckily things are normal and it's morning dawn. Now I take a while to try and calm down, but I can never shake the feeling, and that headache seems to come back again with that pain just in specific areas, like somebody's got a needle on my brain. It felt really bizarre, and it kind of made me feel almost like I was gonna vomit and extremely uncomfortable. I pack up my things and then I notice something's odd. There are some carvings around where I was camped that definitely weren't there before, and things are different. I look and I can see some kind of skulls carved into the stones. This is definitely done relatively recently, but there's nobody around. It's like somebody's took a chisel and really perfectly carved out skeleton faces, but all of them have some kind of cracks like they've got damage. There was only 3 of them in total, but it's extremely odd. I'm not really sure what to make of it, and these are far too heavy to move, but this was really odd. It almost looks like ancient ones that maybe the Indians would have made from Native America, but I wasn't so sure this is actually what it is. I just have a really bad feeling that I've camped in the wrong place, and I quickly get my things together, load up the pack and head out. Now, when I'm walking, I just cannot shake the feeling that something's about to go wrong again. I don't have too much longer left on this trip, and I don't want to let the whole thing be ruined. The other thing too is I'm pretty scared that this is going to change my confidence for doing future expeditions like this on my own, and that was never my objective, so I just try my best to be brave. I stop and make one of my favourite coffees and just do all of my favourite things. I start eating some things that I really like and eating some gummy bears. I think the sugar rush made me feel much better and I start to forget about the things worrying me. I think that's one of the most important things in life and there's really an art to it, but in this situation it's definitely needed. I make sure that I drink lots of water now because I'm worried that something's wrong. But I eventually make it up to one of the stations and thank God there's a few more people there. They ask me what's wrong and honestly say that I look like I've seen something. They say, did an animal attack you? Did someone hurt you? Are you okay? I say, no, I'm fine, just tired. There's probably about 4 other people at this station and I'm really relieved to see more people. I then ask how their hike was going and they say that it was going pretty well, but there's been some reports of other campers and hikers seeing something looming in the woods. I asked them to describe it and they say it was almost like a tree was moving, and when I hear that, my heart drops. I suddenly think of the dream that I had the night before and I go to tell them saying, it could be anything. Are you sure it wasn't a tree falling? And they say no. And for whatever reason, my brain just shuts down and I almost feel like if I tell these people, they're going to think I'm insane and report me or something, so I decide that the best thing to do is not tell anyone. I know it's a pretty selfish thing to do, but by the way, it was only a dream I had, so would I be crazy to think anything of it? I think so, and decide that everything's okay. I fill up on the supplies and I start to feel better and have some normal conversations, and you know what happened? I almost completely forgot about it. I think I just needed to reconnect with more humans and I'm able to completely forget about the things that are worrying me and I feel much happier. I can feel myself smiling again and I had a really good time, and I've actually stayed in contact with one of the people I met there. We've actually went on a number of hikes together since and I've really had a great time. But anyway, I'm going away from my point here. So, after a really nice evening, the morning breaks and it's time for me to go on my merry way. This part of the hike is actually my favourite. The trees all appear very varied here and the light is piercing down ever so beautifully. There's a few butterflies and everything, and honestly this is more like an image of heaven, which is in big contrast to my dream previously, but at the time I'd forgotten about the dream. I continue, and I seem to be getting further and further away from what I know. The path that I'm on is just kind of like gravel, but you know, the one that's only really formed because of people walking on it a lot. It feels nice to know where I'm going and that other people probably come here on a regular basis. That's when a jogger comes to overtake me. Now weirdly, I didn't seem to hear them coming up on me. They just seemed to go right around me. I say, oh sorry, half expecting them to say, oh sorry in return, but they don't say anything. They just jog off ahead of me. I stopped to watch them jog off. I don't know why, I just kind of felt like doing it and just to take a break for a moment, and they eventually do so. And that's when I hear the sounds of stones being thrown. And some kind of deep echo, like something was thrown in a very large concrete room. The sound seemed to bounce for too long, almost like it's coming from a cave, but we're outside here. It doesn't happen too often, but maybe every 5 or so minutes, but I realise that this is exactly what I heard in the dream, and I'm being taken over by the fear now. I convince myself that it's nothing to worry about, but I know something's definitely off. It was kind of like I was going back to the place I was scared of. I closed my eyes for a few seconds to try and calm down, and that's when I see it again. I can see a kind of animal skull face for a couple of seconds. It's very faint, but I'm certain I've seen it, and I now realise that something's really off here. I kind of cough to clear my throat and say, hey, anyone. wanting to hear a familiar voice back, but I don't hear anything. The other hikers weren't actually coming my way, and I don't know where the jogger is gone, but something felt weird now. Up to my right, the trees become very dark and shadowy, and I'm almost sure that I could see movement at first. I can see something dancing through the trees, and I presume it's just a jogger as they're getting away from me, but something felt different now. I decide now that I have to get back to another station, because when I get to this one I've pretty much completed my trip and I'll be able to hike out to the cars again in the morning. So I haven't got too much further to go now. I've really picked up the pace, but while I'm walking I keep hearing that sound again of the stones being thrown, and also some kind of faint drum. It seems very deep, but it seems to be getting quicker and quicker in tempo the further on I go. I ended up holding my head and closing my eyes again, hoping to make sense of this, but it doesn't. I start pinching myself to make sure that I'm not in a dream, but it definitely wasn't. I managed to put these feelings to the side, and eventually I don't hear much of anything, but something was off. I ended up getting to where the station is and where that I'm going to set up camp, and there's no one around. I suppose it is probably a good thing because I wanted some peace and quiet here. I began setting up my tent very early because, I don't know, I just didn't want to do that in nightfall. I decided to take a good look at the surrounding area, and I actually go up a tree a little bit just to try and see anyone or anything. I'm not really good at climbing, but the way the branches are on this tree, it almost makes a ladder. I get about halfway up when one of the branches snaps and I scream out a swear word. I throw the branch on the floor and actually punch the tree stupidly, but that was fine. At least the ones underneath me didn't give way. I'm able to take a really nice look around now, and I don't see anything again. I decided that the best thing that I could do now is make a nice cup of decaf coffee and try and enjoy the sunset that I can kind of see through the trees, and I do just that. Now maybe the sugar, or lack thereof should I say, and the familiar flavour kind of settled me again, and I think, yeah, you're just overthinking, maybe it's time to lay off some of the solo hikes for a while, and I quietly agree with myself. I eventually watch the sun go down and I go back into my tent, but I'm not settled. I'm alert, and it's almost like I'm waiting for something to happen. You might be wondering what was going to happen, and to be honest, so was I. I couldn't say what it is because nothing was putting me in danger now, but I had the feeling that I was watching things happen. Almost like if you're in a movie and you know there's going to be a jump scare. That kind of feeling, but maybe not as intense. It was a pretty weird one that I hadn't felt to this degree before. I eventually closed my eyes and drift off for a few seconds before waking up and quickly closing the tent. I almost hit myself for being stupid and not closing the tent because I'm not really worried about the thing outside, but just other people or creatures. I have my things together and I'm holding my flask using the warmth for some kind of comfort. I kind of get halved into a dreamy state when I can suddenly hear a sound again. Now again, it's almost like a very, very distorted sound of a low tempo wind or low in tone. It's almost like if you've got just enough air coming through a window, but almost like you'd hear it in a cave, but things are different again. I open up my eyes and it's just like last time, but I didn't remember it in the moment. I'm in my tent and this time it feels different. Where I am now is actually much more cold. The ground feels hard, almost too hard, like granite I guess. I slowly unzip my tent and it's much more bright out. I look around and I can only describe it as a giant cave. It's weird because everything's almost slightly too bright, almost like you're halfway to heaven, but I'm inside some kind of cave and I can hear air rushing through everything. It's such a creepy horror movie sound. It really could be used for anything, I think, and I don't want to try and recreate it because I don't like the memories of it. but it was really harrowing to say the very least. Now I'm much more confused now because obviously I'm not in the forest and I don't know if I'm dreaming. So I try and pinch myself, but not much makes a difference, and I think maybe I am actually awake now. I was incredibly confused, and I know I have to get out of here. I get myself up off the ground again. I look around and there's nothing, just like last time. Now, I need to make my way out of this, and the ground feels very cold and wet. The ground's now covered in some kind of low level of white liquid. It feels like water, but once you take your hand off of it, it immediately disappears. And I kept feeling like I had it on my skin, but every time I went to wipe it, there was nothing there. It was almost like something very cold had touched me, and that made me think that there was water on me when in fact there wasn't anything. Now I look up ahead, and I can see that this stretches for miles and miles. I look around, and it's the same the other way, and I wonder if I'm actually trapped here. I look behind myself, and that's when I see it again. This strange tall creature just glaring at me, but this time different. It's hard to describe, but kind of like a slender man, but almost a bit more thick. I actually look over towards where a face should be, but again there's nothing there. And while I do so, I hear a voice that tells me run. This sounded like it was coming from directly behind myself, but I know nobody's there and this is silly, it shouldn't be happening. But I had to listen to it, and I turn around and start sprinting. And it's almost like the ground is moving with me, like I'm running on a treadmill. The scenery isn't changing, and I realise this and come to a stop again. I look behind, and now there's a wall closing me in. I start running forwards just a little bit quicker now, and the ambient sound is increasing, again with some kind of knocking or something. While I'm running ahead, I can see the ground forming, and it's almost like there's nothing but white air below me, if that makes sense, almost like everything else is covered in some kind of fog. I run like this for a very long time, until I realise that I'm not making it out of here. That's when suddenly I hear a voice again, telling me just to move. I don't know if this is in my head, and I start hitting my face, but it doesn't do anything. I stop until I eventually collapse on the ground, and just like that, I can see something running towards me. It's those creatures again, but lots of them, not just one this time. They're coming closer and closer to me, and I pull myself up off the ground. I then see another one of those, but this time it felt almost warm, pointing me in a direction. It has what looks like a large stick, which is very dark for a finger, but it's pointing me towards some light. I then hear it telling me to run into the light, and that's just what I do. I run, and eventually I see a very large pool of water. The creature is then floating next to me and tells me to jump, and that's what I do. I jump and land in the water, and within seconds I'm immediately flashed back to the real world. Now I wake up and I scream. It took me about 5 or 6 seconds to actually normalise and I get my bearings. I wonder why I'm so sweaty, and I think it was just a nightmare that I had, but when I go to take off some of my clothes I realise that I'm covered in water. And you know what? This is exactly like what I'd seen in the dream. Very cold and white in colour. I say, what the hell is happening to me? And I start to dry myself off quickly. I think maybe I've got some kind of weird medical condition, but what could I have had? Why did it link into my dream? I now lay collapsed on the floor for probably 10 minutes and fall asleep again. Except this time nothing happened, and I wake up feeling a lot better now. When I get up, I realise that I'm still a little bit wet, but it seems to be more like normal sweat this time. And I look around and I hesitantly put my hand on the tent opening. I don't want to open the door this time because I don't know what's going to be out there. I tell myself to calm down and that everything's okay, and I slowly unzip the tent. I make my way out and everything's as it should be. I let out a really big sigh of relief and everything's as it should be again. I laid there for probably about another 20 minutes until the sun kind of rises enough that I should be able to make my way the rest of the way out of there, and I feel great now. Great in the sense that I'm not in immediate danger, and I tell myself that I need to go to the doctor because no one should be dreaming like this. This is really horrifying for me. And I dust myself off and pack up my things, and I see it. Another skull. Just like the one I'd seen before, but how? It looks like somebody's chiseled it in again, but not recently, like this had occurred about 500 years ago. But it's right next to where I was camping. I didn't even realise the rock before and it's embedded in the ground, but how could that be? I go to touch it until my hands start shaking, and I don't think this is a good idea. And I tell myself that you just have to make it out of here. Now I know everything could have just been a dream in my head, but it gets weirder. At least I'm telling myself that at the time, that this is all just a dream and everything's fine. While walking through the forest, it felt really weird this time. I didn't have that much further to go now, and something just felt really odd. I don't know, I couldn't describe it. But it was almost like I'd seen too much, and like I was a soldier coming back from war, completely out of place with whatever bright or positive environment that you left me in. It was almost like my senses wouldn't let me switch off, and that I was in somewhere but was constantly out of place. I'm forever looking around myself trying to find answers. I keep checking over my body for any signs of what could have been happening to me. I was just really hoping that maybe I had some kind of cut, maybe some kind of injury or illness that would explain all of this, but everything is like it should have been. I desperately hope that I can see some kind of hikers or anyone who can just put their arm around me and say it's okay, because this time I feel like I desperately need help, but again it doesn't come. I make it about halfway out when I set up my camp again. I feel impossibly tired now. And I think it was just from the mental fatigue and exhaustion because of how intense these dreams are. I collapse and I only have time really to set up my sleeping bag. I couldn't be bothered to set up the tent properly, and I'm kind of half in one, if that makes sense. My legs are sticking out, but I don't really care. It's daytime and I've set an alarm on my watch to go off in about 2 hours. Now I fall asleep again. And this time when I wake up in my dream, things are a lot more normal now. I'm in the same forest that I was last time, and there's no weird colours. Everything looks normal, just a little bit too dark. I'm aware that I'm in a dream now, but it doesn't feel as threatening as before. I walk around and not really sure what to do, sit down on a rock, and that's when I notice it. There's a presence that's just appeared to the left side of where I'm sitting. I turn around and I see it, face to face with a huge animal kind of skeleton that I can't describe. I don't know how it got there, but this thing was massive. Probably like the size of 2 basketballs or something if it was to double in size. And it just stares at me. Frozen to the spot, I hear a voice now. In fact, it sounds like multiple voices talking at the same time, and it tells me, do not take that bridge. I was very confused because I was actually planning on taking a bridge home that day on the drive. And I say, what do you mean? And then it suddenly disappears and I'm awoken again. Now, as you can imagine, I was pretty scared, but I was actually getting more angry by the moment. I was tired of being haunted by whatever this thing is, and I was ready to check myself in for help because this isn't normal. I quickly get my things together, and I brush off some insects that actually climbed on top of the sleeping bag, but I didn't care. I get everything together and I start hiking. I hike like a madman now. I actually forgot to drink water and start guzzling it, and I was almost vomiting because I drank far too much too quickly. I have to make it a bit further until eventually I make it to the car park and salvation. What was even better now is that there's lots of other people around. They look at me like I'm a little bit crazy, but I think that's just because I look so exhausted and tired. Someone says, am I okay? And I say, yeah, I just had a rough hike, and they say, oh, no worries, be careful, buddy. I don't actually reply because I'm so lost in my thoughts, and I load up everything into my car, not really sure what to make of my whole experience. I think maybe I have this thing called nightmare syndrome, I think that's what it's called, but where every time you fall asleep you have quite a scary, intense dream, and it can be very tiring. I'm not so sure though, but I know I need to tell somebody about it. The only person that I know will really understand and believe me is my brother, so I decide that that's what I should do. Now I load up everything and I just sit there for a few seconds. I have to calm myself down enough to drive and to actually think about the way that I need to go. Now I have a few options here. One is more of a dirt road, backcountry route, but I decide not to take it. That's going to take me across quite an old bridge, which is pretty high up off the ground and has some running water below it, and I don't know, it could have been a weird coincidence, but I just knew I shouldn't have taken that bridge. It's kind of weird, it was almost like something that I knew and that I was 100% aware of, but nobody really instructed me other than that weird dream I had. So I decided to take the much longer route around, and I text my brother to say that I'm going to be over soon. He says great, I can't wait to hear all about this hike. He doesn't have a clue what's happened, but my god I do. I start driving and all is normal. I flick on the radio and realise that I'm going towards a bridge. For whatever reason I decide that now I should just turn back and go the way that I'd planned before, the longer route, and I do so. I get back into the right lane and I get across to my brother eventually. Some of my friends have asked me, well, what happened during the drive, but kind of nothing. I guess I was so deep in thought that it kind of made time lapse almost. I can't really remember much of it, which is also strange, but I guess I just had far too much on my mind in that moment. Now, eventually I make it to my brother and pull in, and he's already on the drive and says, God, thank God you're here, I was worried sick about you. I say, yeah, it just took a while, I drove the long way. And he said, no, come here, quick. He grabs me and he shows me something. On the news you can see that the bridge has collapsed and somebody was on it. Somebody unfortunately lost their life as the bridge collapsed and their car went straight into the water below with very fast running water. They would have had no chance to survive it. My brother actually had tears in his eyes because he thought it was me that day. Now that's when it suddenly dawns on me. I don't really believe in guardian angels. Whatever I saw was more similar to the Grim Reaper, but I don't know what it could have been. I really think something was sent there, in whatever dimension it was, to communicate with me, to warn me about something very dangerous happening. And if that hadn't have happened, I probably would have died on that bridge. I really don't know what my story is getting at here, but I just want people to listen and understand what happened to me. I just have too many questions, but now I've come to find more peace and kind of warm feelings from my story. I think whatever spirits are out there, you have good and bad ones, and this may have been a good one that protected me that day. I told my brother about everything that happened and he couldn't believe it at first. He actually thinks it was a guardian angel that saved me, and he believes in me, thankfully, and that's all I need, just one other person to believe my story. Thank you for listening to this because it's kind of great for me to get it out of my system. I hope there's more people who can survive things because of weird occurrences like this, but it's still pretty creepy what happened. If it was my guardian angel, then I wish it didn't look so scary. Now, doing nighttime jogs was one of my favourite things. It was really nice to be out by the streetlights, and I never dared really to go towards a real forest because I kind of thought they were quite creepy. Once or twice I actually got caught out in the forest and it did scare me a bit. I remembered one time that most of my friends had actually gone away and I was basically on my own. So I decided that I should probably do some exercise just to keep my mind happy. Now my brother had actually went on holiday too, and I kind of regretted not going. The thing was, I went away with these guys before and I really come to not enjoy it much, and I just thought it would be a waste of money to do so again. A lot of people were telling me to go, but I just couldn't justify the money and time, and heck, it was only going to be about 1 week. Now, I wasn't actually working at this time, so I was probably especially bored. And like I said, most of my friends had all went away on this one trip, so there wasn't much I could do. And I lived at home with my mum and dad at the time, so I'd actually be quite bored and not really have anything to do whatsoever. It kind of sucked where they lived because it wasn't close to a gym or much of anything, and I don't know, I just thought that was really boring for me. So yeah, I was doing one of my regular jogs and I decided to go through the forest on this one particular day. I didn't really check the time and I'd actually originally decided to walk, so I didn't expect to be jogging. But for whatever reason that bug kicked off on me and I go off into the woods. Now I spent too long on my phone and the next thing I knew, it was already dark, like really dark. So I was out there trying to find my way back when suddenly I hear the sound of a dog. Now this thing is barking really loud, like it kind of makes me jump every time that I hear it like that, and it doesn't let up. It goes on for about a good 10 minutes before I realise that it's getting closer, and this thing sounds menacing, and there's no owner chasing it by the way, so I'm pretty convinced that I need to get out of here. I quickly jump up on the bench and there's an old structure there, and I hear the barking get closer and closer, and then I can see it. Now, I don't know for certain if this is a wolf or not, but my god does it look like one. It looks much bigger than normal dogs, and within a second I'm on top of this structure. And this thing is honestly like a bat out of hell, but coming straight for me. It jumps up so high that it almost reaches over to get me, and it falls back down again and I start screaming for help. I scream a few times and I'm met with only the sounds of the trees moving from the wind, and I realise I'm on my own. And this dog does not give up, or wolf, whatever it is. It's literally trying to climb on top to get me. I go to kick its head when it comes up, but I realise it might bite my foot and drag me down with it, so I decide not to. I don't have any idea how to train myself or what I can possibly do if it comes, so I just get ready to fight basically. Now this freaking thing does not let up for a good 40 minutes. What's worse is my phone that wasn't very good at the time had completely run out of charge, so it's just me, myself and I up here trying to get away from this thing. The other thing too is I was quite cold because I wasn't moving much, so I was worried about getting too cold and being in another kind of danger or getting pneumonia. I don't really know how it works, but you can read between the lines of what I was scared of. Eventually, I hear a very loud crash of lightning, and it disappears. I'm too scared to actually look over the edge of this building because I'm certain that it's going to be there again, but it's completely gone. Now, annoyingly for me, there's an inside part, and this animal could have easily ran and hid inside it, and I wouldn't have known. So now I'm stuck with a dilemma. I can stay where I am, or try and make my way out of there, but I know realistically this thing could run and get me. I decide that I don't have much of a choice now, so I decide to dangle down my headphone cable and actually drop my headphones in case it runs out. But nothing happened. I then have a more ingenious idea and wait for the next flash of lightning, which is actually scarily close to me, to illuminate the surroundings just enough, and I can see that this thing is gone. Now that's what doesn't make sense to me. Within a second, no actually less than a second, this animal completely disappears. So yeah, it was pretty weird that this had happened. I'm very scared and convinced myself that this is the end, and I'm just prepared to go up trees, and while I'm walking back to civilization, I'm always looking for the closest one I can get to. Eventually I make it back to safety, and I ended up jogging home because I was cold. I didn't really tell my parents about what had happened, but I was a little bit concerned about that thing I'd seen. It honestly looked like a wolf, but somehow different. I don't know if it was a new species or what, but I know for a fact that they're not native to the land that I live on, so there 100% shouldn't have been one there, and that creeped me out. Now interestingly, that's not the only scary thing that happened to me when I'd been out in the woods on my own doing some exercise. I remembered that another time I was walking in an area that I thought I knew pretty well when I noticed the path ahead's blocked. There's an old burnt out car which is completely blocking my way, and it's quite weird because it almost looks like the car's just been burnt a few seconds ago, but if you get close to it, it doesn't feel warm at all, and there's no people, no fire engine, and not enough of the ground is burnt, to be honest. The ground should be burnt completely over, but it really doesn't look like it, and I think this is really odd. Not to worry too much though, I have a plan B. I can go all the way around, and that's what I try and do. Now I make it a little bit further up ahead, and I realise that there's a gate which I should be able to scale over and make my way back to a main road. Now I have to be careful here because the gate is a pretty big one, and I don't want to get my legs stuck and probably bleed, because that could be just as dangerous. Or obviously I could hit my head, but you get the point. Now I come up to another area that I'm familiar with, and it's just open land. That's when I realise something moving up ahead. I stay completely still for a few seconds and try and figure out what it is, and I can see that there's a person walking. Not just one, there's multiple. There's 5, then 6, then 7 people all walking in a single file line. They're wearing some kind of overalls, but they're carrying something, and I can't make out what it is. Now I can't be certain, but there's a very large box which they're carrying on their heads. And weirdly when they're walking, they don't seem to make a sound whatsoever. And this is something that really creeps me out. I actually don't have a clue how they move so silently in this kind of situation, but they did. Whatever they're carrying seemed to be really heavy, but they're not making any signs of struggling. Now they walk off into the trees literally and disappear. The thing I didn't get is the way they walked is literally straight into some really dense, like, I don't know what you call it, but like plants and things. But they should have made noise and they shouldn't have been able to walk so directly into it. But guess what? They did. And that still freaks me out to this day. So yeah, as you can imagine, for about 5 or 6 years I didn't actually go into the woods whatsoever. Not really for anything, I just didn't see the point because I actually got bored of it all. I know it looks beautiful and great, but after a while it can become quite the same. But for some reason I started to get that bug in me again to go back out into the forest and just jog. And what do you know, I ended up doing it quite regular, which is back to the start of my story. It was one of those days and I decided that I was going to go further into the forest. Now, this was actually during a summer's day, so everything was really warm and dry, which was great. You did have a number of different insects and bugs that you had to be careful for, but that wasn't too much of an issue. I made my way into quite a nice open area, and I jogged for about a good 10 minutes before stopping. I actually should have brought some kind of longer bottoms, but I didn't, so my legs were getting cut up pretty nastily while I was jogging. So I took a while to sit down and just relax and listen to some music, and I had a grand old time. That's when I could smell smoke. Now it took me a few seconds because initially I thought it was a barbecue, like don't ask me why, but this is exactly what I thought. And suddenly I realised that it feels too warm where I am. And honestly, for a second I thought I might have passed away or something, it was that weird. Everything has this glow to it, and I realise that there's a fire, and a big one. Not only that, some of the houses near me have actually caught fire. I look around to see how far the fire goes, and then I realise it doesn't stop. Literally all around me is fire, and there doesn't seem to be anywhere I can go. I start panicking now as I look over. All I can see is a very tall wall which protects something. I don't know what it is, it's like trains or whatever, but it's impossible for me to climb it, literally. Even if you're the best in the world at parkour or climbing, there's no way that I'm going to get over it. Now, the fire actually begins spreading, and it's kind of coming parallel to me. It means it's not going directly to where I am, but I can see any opportunity for escape getting narrower and narrower, and I decide to assess the situation. I quickly take the deepest breath that I can, and I jog towards it. I didn't realise how quickly I'd get out of breath doing so, but I now quickly scan my surroundings. I certainly can't jump through this, and I can't hear any fire engines or anything, so I know I'm in big trouble. There is a kind of canal thing that runs off. I don't know whether it's a stream actually, but I know that that's dangerous too because the water runs very quick through here. And I realise that if the fire does spread on either side, I'm gonna drown trying to escape. And then I have to catch my breath again, so I sprint back in the exact direction that I've just come from. I now start to scream and swear, calling out for help as quickly as I can. I managed to call through to the fire department, and they say that they're aware of the situation just to stay where I am and that help's coming. They tell me don't move whatever I do, but I say no, I'm gonna move. And I say I'm gonna turn off my phone now because I need to save the battery, so I do so and don't listen to their reply. Within those couple of seconds that I made the call, the fire actually starts spreading at a much quicker pace now, and it starts to engulf me, and I realise that I have no other options of what to do. I start to get as much air into my lungs as possible and try and breathe out all of the carbon dioxide that might be in my system. I take one last breath and I dive into the water. Immediately I hit my head and I start bleeding because I've gone into some rocks, because the water's actually less deep than I think, and I'm really struggling to stay afloat. I lose my phone immediately upon impact and I start drifting backwards. Now I didn't realise too, but again the fire had spread even closer and was actually spreading to the wall. The wall was made out of some kind of wood and it wasn't fire resistant whatsoever. I now realise that there's a small clearing where this goes under the wall, but I don't know what's on the other side because I can see smoke coming from here. I decide that I don't have much of an option, and I quickly take my last breath. I close my eyes and I just try and be as peaceful as I can, because if I don't make it, it's not going to make much use panicking now. And within a second, I'm ejected on the other side, and there's no fire. It takes me a while to figure out where I am because I've actually never seen this, but there's some really old rail tracks here. I quickly surface again, and I go to find my phone, but it's long gone. I can't stay for too long because the fire is also spreading on the wall and I can see it at the very top. I eventually beeline it towards where I think civilization should be and thankfully make it to a road in safety. I never recovered my phone, and luckily nobody got hurt in the fire, but my god, I still have nightmares about this thing. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat remembering the situation that I was in. During the summer of 2008, it was a rough time to graduate from college. I just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer it had become an escape to the point of obsession. Now, Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helps my mental health while I was worried about my life purpose and future. It was June and unseasonably cold and wet. It was even cloudy. The daylight highs barely touch 50 degrees, and at night, it could easily go way below freezing. But despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funnily enough, was to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake is a challenge to get to and actually requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is narrowed and a 2-track winding one, pushing its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with a little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting, but the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble comes up from a canoe, overtaking the sounds of rain. The rumbling was not like a distant diesel engine. Now that was a little bit odd. There were no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up on the canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain clouds, but the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound wasn't actually above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into a canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or a truck or bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless made my hair stand on its ends when I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, and I was again left with only the sounds of rain. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout and cleaned it and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. I'm now building up my fire for the night. I sat back to enjoy the evening bit of whiskey. Night comes fast. The mountain ridge put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds had actually obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. There was the sounds of crackling warm fire and rain bouncing off my tent, which were a great comfort and reason for me to lure into sleep. I remind myself that I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walk over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire cracking, I could pick up on that all too familiar rumbling sound which rises and falls in the background. It was growing louder and louder, and closer. I may have had a few many pulls of whiskey, but the noise was definitely ringing up to my camp. I yelled out, "Hey, shut up!" Like a switch being flipped. The rumbling sound stopped, and so did the rain, and my heart skips a beat. I realized that isn't actually a coincidence. There was almost an intelligence, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs onto the fire and retreated back to my tent, more on edge than I've ever been before, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of darkness. Before that moment, I had never felt alone and dangerous at the same time. Now I feel vulnerable and alone. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt that there's actually a million eyes watching me. My paranoia began to subside when suddenly the rain starts again. Not a drizzle, but actually a downpour. I was honestly shocked by this and really glad that I built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but I knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death getting over wet is something I can't really risk. I couldn't feel the rain poodling over my tent though, initially, until I focused on it. I now realise that the storm isn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was truly tantalising. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving essentially wasn't going to be a good idea, especially on the muddy 2-track road, which would have actually been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to stay than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night. I reclined in my chair, then tried to calm my thoughts with deep breathing. The rain isn't letting up though. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz, and weirdly the fire was still going strong despite the rain, and keeping my campsite well lit. I remembered the truck's clock reading 1:06 AM. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 AM in the morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. Now, I didn't feel like I'd drank that much to justify this feeling. I never had it before. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. Tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering in the remains of the fire, I quickly dragged all my junk and pick up and toss things into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 AM before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out as fast as I could down that muddy road, not once looking back. I've never been back to that lake since. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. These are a massive wilderness area of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the US side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of the summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total. The maximum allowed in a group per a permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adults, advisors, scoutmasters and myself. They had wanted to do a 200-miler but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so a waterfall is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in path of something. We visited the falls and camped near to it. That evening, I had the boys working on camp setup while the advisors worked on fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of down trees, brush and bramble. and I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when out of nowhere I hear the most unearthly scream and roar that I've ever heard. It stops me dead in my tracks. I was frozen. The second scream is closer, and the third is closer still. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was actually coming directly towards me now. By the fourth scream, I could actually feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I have never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream, though, actually physically hurt. It snapped me back to reality, and I ran back to camp. My crew heard it too, but what do I tell them? I claimed it was the boar. There's no boars up here, and the advisors knew I was lying, but I didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents and I retired to my hammock about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I'd always set up my hammock at my head height, so about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and mosquitoes at bay. But the tarp wasn't strung up. That's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been around 3 or 4 a.m. when I was awoken by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing. Not an outright cry, but a sob. At the time, I'm hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet, so I listen, totally still, and I'm as quiet as I can be as it crosses into camp. I could hear the change from the brush to granite rock, but could still hear its heavy footsteps as it walks right through the camp and on towards me. At this point, the tarp is still over my head and I couldn't see a thing. I don't know what to do. I had no time as it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, the loud congested sound. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body. Just standing there, time to make a decision. I suddenly threw my tarp off my head and, as I did, to my left, I touched this thing's chest. Now it was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. It was muscular and impressive. Now, it all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it actually bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such a thick thing. Now, by the time I got my headlamp and it was gone, my crew had slept through it all until the sun comes up, and I decided, well, I probably shouldn't mention this. The next day, we moved on a few miles towards base camp and camped on a small island. Campsites on the US side are designated by a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. We were just arriving and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he starts to walk towards it. About 2 minutes later, we hear him yelling, and he comes running back to camp, still pulling up his pants, and tells us that he's just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked him if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he'd hunted bears for years, and it was definitely not a bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this heightened estimate, I imagined that this was the thing that I saw by my hammock. If I touched the chest and it was 6 feet off the ground, then that puts its head at about 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys were now scared. Time to mitigate. I suggest a night paddle. No one's sleeping anymore anyway, so we pack up the things that we have and set out around 8 PM and paddle by a headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to the base so we could be the first crew off the water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfound Lake by a small pitch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There's dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of Pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side narrowly missed the bow of the canoe that I was steering. And there's still no cliff there. This thing was forcibly thrown at us from the tree line. At this, we paddled like hell. We paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and we sat out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to base camp and ended our expedition. Now, they did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy Justin got back for that day from a trip in the same area that we had been to in Bear Loop, and as I was helping him put a boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant stare, almost like a 1,000-yard stare. I thought this was odd, and I say to him, "Well, how did your trip go?" And he said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake / Newfoundland Lake. He said that they thought they were being messed around with for 2 nights on Knife and actually had a rock thrown at them. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that, crew kept coming back from that area with solid stories matching this one. One night, there was a crowd of guides in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another. You know, the screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then from the back corner of the room I hear a chuckle. It's one of the old veteran guides who had been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time that somebody else seen one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said that he'd actually been encountering them for 10 years, and he said they talked to me. This shocked me, and I said, "Like a language?" He said no, telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you, but they can read you like a book. Now, what happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatches. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that the veteran guide spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities. That they can read human emotion as clear as pages in a book, that they know our specialties and our abilities even greater than our own species ourselves. I work as a park ranger, and I had something that I experienced today which I don't quite understand. One of my other worker colleagues had told me that he'd seen something weird that he couldn't explain and wanted me to investigate too. He'd given me the exact location and said that he wasn't going to preface it, he just wanted me to go there and let him know what my experience was, and I said okay. I was actually a little bit cautious, but I'd known this colleague for a while, so I make my way over to that location and I find a door, literally in the middle of the woods, for no reason at all. It looks like quite an old door, but kind of like a grand one that you might see on an old house, and weirdly, it had one of those old door knockers. I look around and don't see anything and decide to get closer and make it up to the door. Now when I get to the door, I can hear a weird sound around it, almost like lots and lots of people whispering, but there's no one around. It's very faint but very distinct. I decide that I should maybe try and open it, but before I do, I'm kind of caught making eye contact with the knocker. It's so creepy looking. It's like an almost demon face one, but I decide to tap on it a few times to knock on the door. And as I do so, for a moment, everything changes to red and black in colour, almost like I'm looking at something through a filter. I look around and I can only describe this as being in hell. I'm in what appears to be a weird cave system or something. I can hear screams all around me, some weird dark figures moving in the distance, and there seems to be blood dripping off everything, and within a second I go back to normal, and the whispering stopped. So I very bravely sprint back and get all the way back to the station and report to my buddy what had happened. He said he didn't know what to make of it too. Now this is the weirdest part. When we went back to investigate with a group of others and were actually recording it this time, it's nowhere to be found. We gone to the exact spot that we had both seen it, and it was literally completely gone, like it never existed in the first place. I found 4 crude gravestones as a child that dated back to the 1860s deep in the woods. Now they're gone and no one seems to remember. I don't have much of a story, and the title pretty much summarizes it, but I go to this area often as an adult, but nothing's ever there like before. I remembered when I found them and showed them to my stepmom and dad. I know I did, but 25 years later they act like they have no clue what I'm talking about, as if it was all a dream. The footers of the headstones would have suggested young children. I'm not even sure if this is correct, but I'm just looking for closure. I know what I saw it multiple times. I used to spend half the day hiking there, and I'd just sit there with them as a kid. I'd like to mark those kids' graves because I feel like they deserve not to be forgotten, but no one seems to remember. About a year ago, I moved my family and I to go a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest, and after looking into this matter a little more, I have a lot more detail that I think will paint a clear picture in the end, so please bear with me. The nights here can be extremely loud. Between the crickets, the frogs, and the other things, it can be almost deafening. One night, not too long after we moved in, I had forgotten something in my car and headed out to get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. My dog goes everywhere with me, as I am her whole world, but not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out and looked up and kind of noped. So I walk out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It's dead silent. I still remembered shrugging this off and walking down my front steps and heading towards my car. When I'd gotten about 10 feet from the car, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around and see nothing. After I reached in my car for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of the hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door rattle. At first I thought it was a rabbit that I had spooked, as I had seen one just earlier in the day. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock landing a few feet away from me. I hit the walk and bounced into the shrub. I drew my gun and called out and said, "Whoever it is, you're about to be shot." After a few seconds of nothing, I began to feel like maybe this was some local teenager messing with the new people. I holstered my sidearm, turned around and started walking towards my front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep panting sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me note back to my front door was that it sounded like it's right behind me. I leaped up onto my porch, turned around and drew my gun again, expecting something right there, but there's nothing. A couple of weeks later, I was on my porch at night sitting on a bench with my wife. She just got up and walked in to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard the panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere and it was loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped back into my home. Now at this point I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happened, I decided to let it go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This is around 9 PM, and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing it is. Now me growing up in Oregon, I love the rain, And for the past 10 years, we lived in Vegas where it would dump the entire year's worth of rain, but suddenly be bone dry for the rest of it. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, it was such a rare thing, and she loved going outside to watch it. So for us, this is actually an enjoyable thing. Except this particular night when things took a weird turn. As we're sitting there talking about how relaxing the rain sounds, my wife stopped me and said, "Do you hear that?" "No. What did you hear?" I swear it sounded like a small child calling out for help, right in the woods. No, I didn't hear anything." And after a few moments of us listening, we hear it again, or at least she does. I say, "I don't hear a thing. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" And she looks at me offended, saying, "No, I'm positive. It was our son. I think he's out there and lost." I say, No, he's sleeping on the couch." We then both look through the blinds that were right open behind us, and we can see all of our children laying there. She said, "That's so weird. I swear it sounded like our son." I said, "Well, it isn't him. He's right there. And besides, I don't hear anything." She then stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to look now." At this point, if you knew my wife, you would know she is absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I have been listening intently and there is absolutely no one calling out for help. You stay here." At this point, I'm getting worried about her. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention that she was 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, "What if there is a child out there in the woods?" I said, "Well, first off, I would be able to hear it too. Secondly, there's no other kids around here for miles and miles, and what's the odds of them being lost out there?" She said, "I know, but what if it's a kid?" Before I could say anything, she stands up and starts walking towards the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her again, saying, "You're not getting out there. I don't know what's going on, but you need to stay inside," and it thoroughly freaks me out. A few moments after this, just as it's getting dark outside, I heard the front door open and I get up to investigate. Now we have 2 twins who are 6 years old, and we have the door set up so they can't open it without us there. So to hear this sound, it could only be my wife. That was weird, and the fact that she doesn't usually go outside without telling me. I walked out the front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our home. I asked her what she's doing. She said that no, I was just sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying in the woods. I said, "Seriously, and you just decide to walk off to investigate?" She then looks into the woods and says, "See, there it is again." And again, I can't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely silent out again. I told her, just like before, the chances of a baby being out there in the woods outside of our home is slim, and that she needed to get back in the house. She said, "What if somebody's baby's there?" I said, "Well, if that were true, I would hear it too." Now at this point, I was getting really worried about my wife's mental health. I actually asked her to see a psychiatrist, but she did. Now looking back, I felt really bad about this, but I had to do it. Now a few days after this, we went out on the porch. It's early evening and I just mowed the lawn this day, and our 3-year-old son was riding around on his little car in front of the house. Now he knows that he's not to go outside of a certain area that we mapped out. He loves playing outside, but with the road behind 50 feet or so from the porch, we have to be careful. So we're always cautious, and as we're talking, we both keep an eye on him. A neighbour drives by and stops to say hello. The interaction literally took 8 seconds, as of them basically asking how we are and stuff. He then says he's going to stop by later as his wife got something for the kids. And we said, "Okay, great," and he drives off. I now look over to where that our son should be and he's nowhere to be seen. I called out his name again and can hear his car on our side drive. I scold him for leaving the area and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our home. I said he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front or else, and he adamantly pointed in the direction of the woods again, kept trying to tell me something. I look off in the direction of the woods and just assumed that he saw a squirrel or deer or something and wanted to see it up close. I walk him back up to the front of the house and he actually cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious and like most 3-year-old boys are. Now, this incident wasn't an isolated one and both of our twins have weirdly done something similar, but not quite as extreme as this. There have actually been nights where we've just laid down and hear a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I couldn't see anything. Now, the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. Now, I put on my slippers and grabbed one of my 12-gauge shotguns and walked out to investigate. It was dead silent again. The floodlights are on again on the side of the house, and I think this is pretty weird, but I get there and there's nothing. I then walk back around the house and shine the light around intently. As I approached the back side of the house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone was watching me. I shine the lights up the tree and don't see anything. I round the corner, and the first thing I notice is that my 3 dogs that are in my area aren't making a sound. Now our dogs have no filter and bark at everyone and everything, including me. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs had me horrified, really. As I kept walking, all of a sudden, the crickets and frogs start making sounds again. It was as if that somebody flicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said, okay, as long as our dogs are okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs sleep in and with us. This very thing happened on all 4 exterior walls, not just one. It's random but annoying, but terrifying nonetheless. There's also been a few times when we're sitting in the house as I was watching a movie, and my wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I said no, and she said that she could have sworn that she heard my name, and I said no, I didn't say anything. She said it was definitely my voice, but she doesn't understand because it sounded so close, but I was 20 feet away in a recliner. The important part to this is that she was sitting at the table doing something and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now our patio sits about 20 feet off the ground and is like a balcony as it has no stairs to access it. I think the previous owner built it for barbecuing. There have been several instances where she would say she heard somebody whispering in my ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking she was crazy, but as you'll see, this is all tied to one final moment. The last thing I want to mention before we get into what happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of the property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I needed. The range itself is cut straight into the woods, going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the range, you have the woods surrounding you on all sides except for getting back to my shop. I have to say it always felt creepy when I am dealing with my targets or mowing. When you are down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone. Now one day around 5 in the evening, I was sighting a new scope on my rifle. The sun was still up, but it was going to fade soon. So I knew this was going to be the final test. Now, up until this point, there was nothing really happening while I made my multiple trips downrange, other than feeling weird. As I get downrange, I kept getting the feeling that somebody's watching me and I can't shake it. I look around and don't see a thing. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off the side behind me. It sounded like a large branch snapping off a tree. Now, if you've been in Tennessee before in the woods, you know that this happens a lot, especially in the middle of nowhere. So this is nothing new, except for this time it was very loud and it sounded like fresh strong wood, if that makes sense. I turned around again but can't see anything. I start walking back up to my rifle and I swear I heard somebody right behind me. I turned around again but saw nothing. As I start to walk again, I hear this deep growl. It really sounds deep and loud, and what's worse is that it's actually all around me. I turned around facing the range and start walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging me is really terrifying, but I know running's not a good idea if this is the case. So I walked slowly backwards up the hill with my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever this thing is. I left 10 rounds in the mag and grabbed my rifle bag quickly, going back up to the house. Now fast forward to roughly a year later, when we moved in and my niece is staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money. We're on our way back from the store about a mile from our house, and I saw 2 eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a wide tree on the side of the road just ahead. It took all my attention because they were higher than a deer but a different size and colour. Just as I said, "What's that?" they squint and vanish. I had made a comment that it was almost as though it had known that I could see its size and suddenly moved. The colour was kind of golden green, but they resembled the mannerisms of a large cat and felt ominous. It's really hard for me to explain, but I really can't define exactly what I saw. It's truly like nothing else. Now, a few moments later, when we arrive at the house, as we were getting bags out of the car, my 3-year-old son come bolting out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting to help her carry in the bags, I heard my dog growl. I look in the direction she was looking, and it's at my neighbour's property across the street. Now, what I saw has kept me up all night. Up till this point, I've always been skeptical that anything was out there, as I've never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Now, my street is on a kind of spread out neighbourhood. Each house actually sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is Kentucky Lake. Our neighbour's house sits adjacent to the house on an acre lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres which are untouched. As I was looking across the street to my neighbour's property, I see a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big moving quickly. Then it came into clear view and stood up. At first, it looks like a man, almost walking like one, and I don't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but what was strange is that the distance it covered was really not possible to be made by a human. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than anyone can sprint. More importantly, there's no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality when it moved. I shout out, "What is that?" and realise that it's looking directly at us. It's moved at such a crazy angle that it's minimising its body now to not be seen so well, suddenly going silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realised that whatever it is stalking us. I tell my niece to go in the house now, and I grabbed my AR-15 with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out the car. Knowing her, I tell her very firmly that you have to get back in the house. Her disregard to my command annoyed me, but I still watch over her without saying a word as she was slowly walking. She turned around towards the woods and across the street from my house, and then suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the stairs in a panicked state, and she said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loudly on the leaves. When I turned around, I heard a deep growl." I asked her why she didn't come when I told her, and she said that she thought I was talking to the sun. I told her about what I'd seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see anything. I told her it's not a good idea, but she goes anyway. She begins walking down the walkway, and I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. I told her to stop and come and take the flashlight. Now at this point, she's about 3 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught the glimpse of something grey and hairy bolt from the SUV back across the street into the woods. My porch is a raised porch, and our SUV is about 6.5 feet tall, and whatever this thing is, cleared about 45 feet in what appears to be a single jump. It moves honestly like lightning. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped in front of the car and caught my line of sight and was waiting for her. Now for whatever reason, she still doubted my warnings and grabs a flashlight and walks back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stops dead in her tracks, leaning forward as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw, and she turned and ran back on the porch terrified, saying no, no, no. She said it was a figure hiding inside of a tree, and she saw its eyes. I asked her what do they look like, and she said dull red at first, but as she gets closer it appears almost dead. She said it kind of looked really dark grey and was hard to describe, but the pupils were looking like something that's blind. She wanted to go out again and took a step down the stairs, and as she did, it revealed itself from the tree again. I said, "Get inside now." I went in and locked the door and look and see a tall human-shaped being, looking really tall and ominous as anything. The next morning, we actually do a height comparison to the tree limb she saw it, and it must have been about 9 feet, and apparently its eyes are about 6 feet apart. At this point, I don't know what that thing is, and after doing some research, I think it was maybe a crawler or glimmerman. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in my area, but none. More importantly, I swear it would phase in and out of almost like a shadow person or being. Now, I don't know what to make of this, and I don't know if this thing could communicate telepathically somehow, because it would explain how I always had a weird feeling and could hear things, or my wife would at least. Secondly, it has like a playback communication, so when I heard a dog panting, it was probably one of the dogs that this had heard and then replicated somehow, and the same again with some of my children. Now, it really scares me. I hate the fact that I've seen something like this. Now, the more I read about this thing, the more everything that's been happening over the past year makes sense. One thing I find extra convincing is that down the road towards the lake, there's a property that is barbed wired off and is a wall of forest with no driveway. A lot of the properties on our road is undeveloped owned land, and no one on these actually goes to live there, but there's a sign that says Screamer lives here, with an arrow pointing into the woods. Now I have to admit that when I first saw the sign I actually laughed, thinking it was maybe the owner screamed at trespassers, but now I'm not so sure. I have some stories to share. They're all true, but I don't know, I'll start with the weirdest one first. When I was like 5, my parents had bought a house with a large yard, about an acre back, and there's a forest. One day, my granny was babysitting me. I decided to run around the backyard and play. She went inside to go to the bathroom. I remembered something beckoning me to go into the forest. Just a strong urge, so I do. I didn't go in very far before coming across a perfectly circular area filled with flowers. The sun was shining on it through the trees. It was so bright, and they're all different colours. There was a buck standing in the middle of it staring at me. I was a little confused, and it looks huge to me. I got a bit closer and it didn't run. It just watches me. I got so excited about the beautiful scene that I actually ran back to tell my granny. When I did, she was looking at me horrified, saying, "Where did you go?" I was looking everywhere and got worried sick. Apparently I'd been gone for a long time. I was confused. Now, regardless, I insisted on showing her what I found. She followed me into the woods, and we went past where all the wildflowers were and some of the deers are. Now, we were exactly where I was, but it was gone. I swore up and down to tell her about what I found, but it just wasn't there now. I remembered being really upset and confused. To this day, I wonder if I walked into some kinds of portal or dimension. When I turned 13, we lived elsewhere, but I started having dreams about a single door in the middle of the woods. It was reoccurring for a number of years and really makes you wonder what's actually out there. I remembered there was a light snowfall the previous day on this particular patrol. There was nothing I had to worry about really. Every so often I'd have to come to the rescue of people that got lost. Usually it was just tourists that would come to our country and want to be out in the snow and forest and not really be prepared for it. They'd often be very cold and not well equipped for the weather. It could be especially easy to get some kind of frostbite out here. Now, it's always cold all year round, but it can be especially nasty in winter. So that was what I was expecting most of my day to be like. Now, I remembered I had the occasional urge to look over my shoulder, but I fought against it. The scenery was okay. It wasn't so great today. A lot of the snow had went a bit slushy. Water was frozen and the paths were a bit muddy too. Every so often I would see some hikers and I'd say hello to them. Often they'd get confused about where they needed to go, and it was my job to redirect them into the right areas of the wilderness where they were allowed to go. Now, eventually I have to get a bit further away from people because I need to go to the outskirts of where my ranger station patrols. This is where we'd get the most weird activity. Every so often we'd hear things in the night here that we couldn't pin down to a particular animal. All of the animals that we get here should be pretty scared of us, but I don't know. It seemed like you could almost guarantee that when you went here around 12 at night, you would hear a strange animal call that sounded very big. It sounded like a very large creature had to make it, so yeah, I was always cautious while being here. I eventually come up to the very perimeter of where I need to patrol and go through the gate. I'm now away from the people and the atmosphere is a lot different. Because of this being in close proximity to water, there was almost a mist covering everything. I think it's called sea drift, but I don't actually know the correct term for it. But I start making my way through the trees and I'm just having my general search. I have another buddy that's working with me and he's covering the area that I've come from, so I feel pretty safe to be out here and freely roam around. All of the trees here don't have any leaves on them, so it means that if you're not careful, one of the branches will get you in the face or neck, so I'm constantly cautious of this. I eventually make it through to a clearing and all is as it should be. I have the body of water to my right, and I'm just conscious to make sure I don't get too close to it, because sometimes it can be deceiving how close you are to danger. Now, I do notice something's odd. The gate that I've just come from is now open, which is pretty bizarre. I look around and I'm convinced that I closed it. In fact, I even remembered the sound of it closing. But when I've looked back, it's 100% open, and I know for a fact that I haven't done it. So I think this is odd. I quickly just have a look around to make sure that nobody's actually followed me in, but there's no one whatsoever. But I try my best not to let it bother me and just think, well, it was probably just in my head, and I guess the gate flung itself open again. I ended up going a little bit deeper in now. Now, I'm getting further and further away from the water, so it's getting a bit less and less misty, and this makes me feel more confident. I'm now into an area that's basically only used by us. It's where we have like a large cabin shed thing. I don't know what you guys call it again, maybe what you guys refer to as a barn. But it's basically where that we keep all of our equipment that we're not using. We had some pretty cool things here too. We actually had like a little ATV and off-road thing that we would use sometimes to rescue people, or just as like a rapid response thing, but we've got no need to use it this particular day, so I just continue up ahead like normal. Now eventually I get to the very end of where I need to patrol, and that's when I hear it. The sound. Ah yes, the sound that we've grown so accustomed to, and one that I'm not actually scared of now. I call back and say, hey, are you going to show yourself today or what? I don't say it in English but my own language, but the sound stops immediately and I kind of laugh to myself thinking, well, today I'm going to dance with this thing. Now I continue on as I do the last part of my rounds until I notice something's up ahead of me. I can see quite a tall creature standing roughly where the shoreline is of the body of water. It looks almost like a snowman, but more similar to a tree in terms of its exterior. This thing doesn't move an inch, and I start walking towards it confident that this is just a person that's hunting and shouldn't be here. I call out, hey, you're not supposed to be hunting here. I actually managed to jog all the way up to this thing without it moving an inch. Until then, it just takes off and heads straight towards the water. I suddenly realised that this isn't actually a hunter, and this is something different. I realised because when it's wading through into the icy waters, it isn't shuddering at all, and it literally just disappears down into the lake. Now, while doing so, I realised that there's a really bad smell around, and I can still see this thing moving underwater, and I now get the scale of it because I've come much closer. It was probably about 6.5 or 7 feet tall, absolutely massive. It's actually swimming more like a fish now that it's underwater, until it stops and stares at me, and its eyes are almost glowing a yellowy orange colour. I was extremely brave and decide to sprint out of there and get all the way back to the station. I radio in what I saw, and some of the guys go out to try and investigate. They say they can't see anyone, just the tracks of somebody or something coming out of the water, getting to the exact spot that I saw this thing at, and then disappearing. But the worst part about it is, all of them think that I made up the story and that I was lying to them, trying to pull a quick one on them. But I know what I saw that day. I haven't seen it since, but it's still really weird. I was travelling solo around the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State and making various stops in the Olympic National Park. I decided to stop in Quintenot for the first time and took a random road that dead-ended at a beautiful spot at the edge of the river. There was an ancient footbridge that led across the river, but it looked as though it might collapse if you try and cross it, so I decided against it. It was off-season, and I was not in a tourist area. I was the only one there. It was so unusually hot outside that I decided I needed to get into the water. I backed my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, faced it out in the direction that I would need to leave. I then start hiking through the thick brush, down an embankment into the edge of the water. It was mid-fall, and I didn't have a suit since I didn't plan on swimming, so I took my clothes off and got in there. I had a nice swim, but I could not shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even though I'm in the middle of nowhere. After about 5 minutes, the creepy feeling was enough for me to head back, so I started to climb out, turned my back to the other side of the river and walked back to where my clothes and shoes are. When I turned around, there was a big tall man standing in plain sight just across from me on the other side of the river, but higher up on the embankment, and I didn't notice him at first. He's wearing a poncho made of animal pelts, had long hair full of sticks and twigs, and looked as though he'd been living out in the wild for a long time. We stood and stared at each other, well, me froze in terror really, for what felt like forever, when all of a sudden he frantically took off on foot to the bridge leading across the water. I grabbed my car keys, Tried to grab my clothes and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I left everything. I went running for my life through the thick brush, blackberries, barefoot, and in my underwear, trying to make it to my car before he made it across the river. There was no doubt in my mind that he's gonna hurt me. When I made it out of the blackberries, I could see that he was crossing the bridge towards me more rapidly. I get to my car, flung the door open just as he arrived. I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting non-verbally. The moment he went for my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as quick as I can. I looked back and he was chasing after me. He must have ran after my car for at least a mile until he faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running through the blackberries. I was unclothed, shaken and crying. Had I have hesitated for 10 seconds longer, I don't think I would have got out of there alive. Even typing out this story all these years later is actually making me shake. I will never ever go back to that area, and since that moment I always bring a hiking buddy with me to be safe. Now I was in Yellowstone riding a bicycle fast down a grey curve. Cars are stopped. I look up ahead and there's a grizzly. I could have easily hit into the cars or the grizzly bear itself. I'm just glad that I made it out of there okay. Now once I was driving into Yosemite at 4 AM and saw something in the road as I come around a corner. I slammed on my brakes and it turned out to be a wolf. Several years later, I mentioned this to someone offhand and they said Yosemite didn't have any wolves. I looked it up and they have exactly one wolf in the park. I realised that I nearly prowled into this one single wolf and I'm very glad that I've managed not to. Once while in a national park, I was chilling in a hammock and my family started yelling at me to run away. Turns out, there was a bear right near me. I slowly walk away and the bear actually went inside my hammock to start eating different things there. Me and my family went on a short road trip a number of years ago. The time of this event was actually in the 1980s, so a good while before you had decent cell phones. We also didn't really have much in the way of satellite navigation back then, so it meant you basically had to rely on maps, and that wasn't always so easy. It was my dad, my brother and I on this particular journey, and me and my brother were acting as key navigators for my father. Now, to say that didn't go well would be an understatement because we ended up miles and miles away from where we're supposed to be, and we basically ended up changing the place that we were going to camp at, just to make things easier. My dad wasn't that bothered though, and we settle into the area that we can park and camp. We did originally plan on setting up our tents, but it was quite late and we just settled down. We're figuring out what we need to do, and my dad suggests that we still make it to the other place because it was close to a beautiful national park and there was going to be lots we could see. We all agree with this and we settle in for the night. Nothing much happened, I just had a feeling that I couldn't sleep easily. When we woke up, someone who was dressed in a hat come over to us. It was clearly a park ranger who said something pretty weird to us. He said, "Hey, I'm gonna have to kick you out of here." We said, "Oh, sorry, we didn't realise this was somewhere we couldn't park or stay." And he said, "No, just you're not supposed to be here." Something about this person seemed really odd, and my dad gave him a funny look and quickly ushered us to get our things ready and drive away. Now, on the drive back, me and my brother kept asking my dad what was wrong and why he looked a bit unsettled, and he then said that there aren't supposed to be any park rangers out here. I thought that was pretty bizarre, but I thought, Maybe they've just expanded somewhere and we didn't realise it. I was pretty paranoid because, I don't know, I was young, but my dad seemed worse than me, and that was a bit worrying because my dad's a pretty strong person and I've never really seen him worry much before. Eventually though, we start making our way to where we're actually supposed to be originally. I don't know, it was kind of a good thing that we got there because I didn't want to spend another night in that place. You know when you feel like somebody's just going to linger around for a stupidly long time for no reason? Yeah, I kind of had the feeling that that was going to happen again. Now, to say this trip was eventful would be an understatement, as you're about to hear. Now, we eventually get to this place and my god, it's beautiful. I've seen some pretty good things in my time, but not much can compare to how beautiful this place was when my dad took us. I was really grateful for it and I found it a really nice adventure to have. I thought it was really funny what had happened earlier. My dad actually settled up a lot and we started to feel pretty good. So eventually we set up our tent and get ready to sleep. That was when it happened. We hear some screaming and it was really creepy. I don't know whether there was some kind of animals getting into some big fight outside, but that's what it sounded like. Until eventually, it sounds just like there was some kind of human intervention. My dad says to wait here as he goes outside the tent and I can hear him talking to someone. The screaming sounds have stopped and I think this is pretty bizarre because my god did it sound like there was all hellfire earlier, so what happened? Me and my brother slowly emerged. I remembered it was very cold outside and my dad was saying to someone, no, just go away, and actually swearing. That's when I realised it was the same ranger that we had seen before. How on God's green earth had this person managed to get to the exact same spot as us again? It's not possible, I said to my brother and thought that maybe it was someone who just looked very similar, but this guy sounded exactly the same. Eventually the guy scurried off and my dad said something about being armed to him, and that seemed to make this person change their tone. They just slowly disappear into the trees like they weren't there before. Another weird thing that I noticed is that this person looks very tired and sweaty, almost like they've been in some kind of big fight, but with who? With what? That we just didn't know. Now, discussing it the next morning wasn't really an option because my dad was really focusing. From early in the morning, he had gone round with his knife and was just patrolling the perimeter like he was looking for something. Me and my brother then say, Dad, what are you doing? And he just shakes his head and says, no, something's just off with that guy and I don't know why. I just can't stop thinking about it. We eventually all agree that we should move our campsite because we don't want to have our trip ruined by some weirdo, but it was really looking that way. So we now go a bit deeper into the woods. We eventually find another really safe place to go, and it's pretty cool. It's kind of up on a hill and you have a good vantage point here, so we're feeling a lot safer now, and we go about our day like usual. We've set up the tent and are getting ready for this night's sleep too. We're not too far from the end of our trip now, and we were actually enjoying it. However, this one particular night my dad just would not fall asleep. Eventually me and my brother do though. We wake up the next morning and my dad looks like he hasn't had any sleep at all. I say, Dad, what's wrong? And he says, well, nothing. We then keep on pressing him to find out what had happened, and again he doesn't say anything at first, until eventually he finally lets up on what happened. Apparently, all night he was sure that he could see the silhouette of someone who appeared to be dressed just like a park ranger, and it scared my dad a lot. We decide that we're going to man out the last night because again we're armed and we're at quite a good point here, but something just felt off about this person. So anyway, what happens? We go to fall asleep the next day and here we are again. Blood-curdling screams that you cannot seem to get away from, and it's really annoying because clearly this is some kind of animal out here and it will not stop making these weird sounds. But then again, we didn't really consider the fact that maybe, just maybe, this was people going at it and maybe trying to kill each other. Well, at least that's what my dad said. Every time we raised the alarm, he said, no, don't worry, just go to sleep. If anyone comes, I'll get them with my life. Now that reassured us a lot and we fall asleep again. Now everything's as it should be the next morning and we get our things together and decide to go. However, while leaving, we do realise something odd. There's blood, and a lot of it. It's only about a 4-minute walk from our tent, but it almost looks like somebody's had a massive sword fight. No, multiple people have had a big sword fight like back in the day. But where are the bodies? The amount of blood on the floor is honestly inhuman, and there must have been at least 1 or 2 more bodies. But nobody's around. And the smell, it smelled so bad. Honestly, like something we've never smelt before. And you can imagine we didn't stick around too long for this. My dad intelligently mentions that if this is what he thinks it is, then we don't want to put our forensics there. Forensics wasn't very advanced back then, but we weren't silly and keep it moving. My dad then goes over to the station to report what's happened, and that's when we see it. All kinds of police cars everywhere, and some law enforcement's coming to approach us. They tell us not to move and we don't, and my dad goes over to talk to them. I don't know exactly what he said, but they actually come and cuff him and us, and we have to go in to give some statements. They don't let on to exactly what's happened, but they just ask exactly why we're out there and what we're doing. Again, I didn't realise this until afterwards, but they actually interviewed all of us independently to make sure that our stories matched up. They asked for the exact spot where we camped, and my dad eventually leads them over there. Me and my brother have to stay with the police, who will not tell us what happened. Eventually, though, after persisting, one of them opens up and says, "You know, they found a few bodies out there?" Me and my brother look at each other, terrified now. It was almost like we didn't want to accept that we'd just walked through a crime scene, but that was exactly what had happened. Apparently, there were reports of somebody imitating some kind of law enforcement or something, following people around, then getting them in the night. And apparently this wasn't the first time that it had happened out here. Now my dad comes back after a while and says, "Come on, let's go." None of us said a word to each other as the police open up their tape and let us through. Now the drive back was pretty much entirely in silence until we pull up on the driveway, and my dad looks me and my brother dead in the eyes and tells us, "Hey, you don't tell anyone about what happened, alright? Especially not your mother." And we both agree with this, and that's that. So after doing some research later, it turns out that somebody would dress up like a police or park ranger and just try and look official in order to follow people around, and this person actually ended up murdering almost 4 people. It turned out we were camping in basically the exact spot where one of the murders took place, and there's a pretty strong chance that he was actually following us, but we were the lucky ones who got away. It still terrifies me. I mean, I don't think I'll ever get over this. In December of 2005, me and a few high school friends were back home from our respective universities. We were juniors at the time and started a tradition winter break of freshman year to visit random state parks / smaller towns and explore them, along with the occasional mischief that we would end up getting ourselves into. During these times, one-night trips, the 3 of us would all sleep in the back of my Tahoe on a large mattress pad. This kept us safe from the elements and set my paranoid mind at ease should we be subject to any foul play. We decided this year to go to the Davy Crockett National Forest area. This area has many places that are extremely rural and desolate, which was exciting because we had previously found some interesting things in abandoned structures on our previous excursions. I had used up the rest of my university printing credits to print detailed MapQuest pages for us to navigate while we were visiting. The drive was roughly 2 hours from our hometown, Conroe. We decided to start the trip off in Lufkin, just east of the National Forest, to eat dinner and get a few things from Walmart. After dinner, we decided to mess around and get into our shenanigans. A few hours later, we found ourselves in Crockett, Texas, about an hour west of Lufkin. We planned on staying in a campground about halfway between the two cities, so had a lot of flexibility when it came time. We explored random roads and went in a few abandoned buildings before getting bored and wanting to go somewhere else. By this time, it was 12:30 a.m. and at this point, I needed to get an energy boost. So, we decided to stop at a gas station in Kennard, Texas, which was about 30 minutes east of Crockett. I go inside and buy a few snacks, energy drinks, and a few cans of Skull to give us some fuel for the rest of the night, which is giving me a nice buzz. We decide to go a little more adventurous and venture down FM 357 south of Kennard. We come across a few Forest Service roads that veered off into rural residential roads and other country roads. I pull off on the side of the road to check the map quest and match the cross streets we're on at any given moment, with my two friends assisting the navigation. After getting back onto the road, I notice it's 1:30 a.m. and we all joke about how miraculously that we're still up. I decide to head down to the next service road we come across. This is where things start to get pretty weird, and where parts of my memory are erased due to sheer adrenaline that I had at the time. After driving down a few more service roads and taking random turns, we go to a road that is much more narrow compared to the others. By this time, I get incredibly frustrated. I mean, it's almost 2:15 a.m. and I don't want to stumble into someone's front yard in a rural area in the middle of the night. I decide to slow down, and suddenly, I noticed a faint light in the distance. Great, just great, I think. I thought about the chance of spooking some random soul awake, but about 30 seconds later, I can tell that these are headlights, but they suddenly disappeared. I thought somebody may have turned up ahead, but I was very wrong. About 10 to 15 seconds later, I see what appeared to be a brand new Chevy Suburban. The second I put my high beams on, its light turned on and three men dressed in suits jump out and sprint down the road past my car. It was almost like they were lifeless and didn't even notice me. As they're running past me, the Suburban suddenly shifts into reverse and conducts the fastest reverse maneuver I've ever seen. At this point, I unholster my G26 and tell my friend to grab my AR. We're all terrified and have no clue what we're about to come upon. As we drove forward, mind you, these were the days where cell phone coverage was literally non-existent in many areas of this state, so we had no way to call for help if anything happened. As we reached the end of the road, we come upon FM 357, the same road we originated from. But how is this possible, I thought. It felt like we're just venturing further and further away from the road, and we passed a US Forest Service fire station again on the way out like we had on the way in. I've recently checked Google Maps for any US Forest Service fire station off of FM 357 and can't find any current or past historical data for that. The county tax assessor does not have any listings either. We got back on the FM 357 and decided to book it downtown Crockett, as we did not feel comfortable with sleeping in a campsite after what just happened. I have since made sure to never venture down any unknown roads whatsoever, without at least referencing the GPS or map. I'm still processing that short but unsettling event. Where did those men come from? Why were they in suits in the middle of the forest, and where did the black Suburban go? Me and my friends actually still occasionally talk about the incident, and no one can come up with an explanation for what happened. The thing that bothers me is that I cannot find any evidence of this road that we're on. Google Earth doesn't have a satellite or any kind of image which lines up with the one that we're on, so this one and truly deepens the mystery of it all. So, This happened in 1989. I was with my boyfriend Eddie, his best friend, my older sister Angie, and about 6 other people. We'd spent the entire day mudding in the Royal Palm mudflats in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, aka the part of the Palm Beach County. I grew up in West Palm Beach. I had never seen anything like this before. After mudding all day, we decided to call it a night and leave. Almost everybody was gone by then, so we all piled into Eddie's truck and left. Eddie saw a small mud hole and drove through it, and we got stuck. The small hole was relatively deceptive. When I say we got stuck, I mean stuck for hours. I was pregnant with my first, so I was steering as the other 9 are pushing. The truck didn't budge. We had no choice but to wait until the morning for someone to come and tow us, as we're now completely stuck. It's about 5 AM. We decided we should just relax and try to sleep until someone come through. Eddie, I and his best friends are in front. My sister and other 6, who we are still friends to this day, pile into the back and start to settle down. We were still making noise when I heard a sound. It was a low grumble. I knew immediately that it was some kind of animal. I tell everyone to hush and listen. Then we all heard it, and it was getting louder and louder and more aggressive sounding now. Eddie has a KC light in his back seat, so he popped it out and lit up the night. That's when our world changed. 10 of us all see something ducking down and moving. Everyone was freaking out because it was clearly there. But what was it? Then it got annoyed, and this thing stood up and let out a roar that I can still remember 31 years later. It leapt through the large brush that it was hiding behind, coming straight towards us, and you can literally feel the shake with every footstep it took. It was 8 to 9 feet tall and broad. It looked like an extremely large man with hair, not fur. It had hair and lots of it. The KC lit it up, and you could see it clumping on the hair. The smell was rotten and sour, and being pregnant, I was extremely sensitive to smell, so it was bad. We had spent hours, we're talking 5+ hours, trying to push this truck out. They say adrenaline gives you super strength, and they're right. Eddie turned on his truck and starts pushing on the door frame. His bestie leapt out of his side and did the same. My sister and the others let out screams as they piled out, and then all you hear is this thing running and roaring. Everybody else was dead silent as they put everything they needed back and start pushing. With a sucking pop, that's all I can describe it as, we're out and we're throwing ourselves into the back as Eddie and his bestie just floor it. This is woods with tight turns, and we literally flew around those. It felt like the devil himself was after us. After we got out and onto the main road, we headed for a gas station to calm down and call our families. When we got there, we all got out, sat with our backs to the wall, and that was it. We never said a word to each other, just sitting there in silence. I think we were too raw, scared and in complete shock over what had happened. This was law. This wasn't real, so why did it exist? Because it was there. Anyway, after we called our parents and went home, one by one being dropped off, not a word was spoken. My sister and I did not discuss it until about 5 years ago, and we finally opened up about it and to others. It's kind of burned into my memory, and I don't know what it is, but it looked just like a Bigfoot. I was going on a road trip with my brother. I hadn't done so before, and we were both very excited to be doing so. We were going to drive across a few different states, and for that I was very excited. The destination was eventually getting to Canada, and that was really the highlight of the trip. We had such a good time when we eventually make it there, but however, during the trip there was one particular event that I don't think I'm ever going to forget. Now let me set the scene. We've been driving for quite a long time, and we didn't come across anywhere to fill up on gas. We also needed to get some more food and thing. I mean, we had enough of, as you say, proper food, but we wanted to get more snacks and stuff, and we're both getting a little bit tired. Now, both of us are pretty good drivers, and we didn't have an issue driving, even if we're a little sleepy, but as you know, that can be quite dangerous. So, we eventually find a gas station that looks pretty good, and we pull over there. We fill up on some gas and we go inside the store and pay for the gas. We also look around and start getting some snacks and things, and I don't know why, the guy at the counter just felt pretty weird. He seemed nice enough at first, but for some reason, as soon as he heard we're out of town, he kind of changed and just stared at us. It was almost like it wasn't a real person and it was some kind of NPC put there. I don't know how to describe it, but the whole thing just felt a bit surreal. We eventually get the snacks as well and leave and tell him to keep the change, thinking maybe that'll make him more happy, but he literally doesn't react at all. We eventually make it back out and my brother says, "Oh, I really need to use a bathroom," and quickly heads back. I say that I'm gonna wait, and he goes in the store and this is what he tells me. Apparently the guy was staring at him the whole time back in and didn't say hello or anything when he re-entered. He said that he really needed to use a bathroom and the guy said he'd show him, and apparently he led him to some really dodgy back area and it looked like he was going to be trapped, and he said, "Yeah, the light's next to the toilet, you'll find it," and went and closed the door. My brother said that he just stood there completely bewildered and confused about what had happened, and he knew he wasn't going to go there. He felt like he was being set up. What's worst is he can quietly hear the door being locked behind him. Rather than panic him, my brother rather smartly went through an open window and come back to me. He quickly gets in and says, "Hey, let's just get driving." Now we probably only went about a minute further down the road before the sky lights up a bit brighter. And then, a few seconds later, we're hit with a very loud explosion sound, and it makes me almost crash into a tree. We both look at each other confused as to what's happening, and honestly we thought that there was some kind of foreign force invading our country. After a number of minutes, we managed to settle down and realise that this isn't the case. Now, we decide that we're going to slowly head back and see what happened, and we're hit with how dark it is. We didn't have to turn around for long before we can see the burning embers where the gas station was. Thinking that guy's just blew himself to pieces in some kind of accident, we frantically call for the cops. We pull over and get out and decide that we need to go and see if he's okay, and that's when we see him. We can see the silhouette of him standing, staring into the flames about 30 meters ahead of us. We both looked at each other and slowly make it back to the car and start driving. We drove for another good 5 hours before eventually stopping, and we don't know what to make of it. Even to this day, we don't know whether that guy was setting up to kill my brother for whatever reason, but I just thank God that he managed to get out in one piece. This story happened when I was about 15, so many years ago. Now, during the summer, I'd been doing quite a lot of house sitting. That was for my grandfather's property that he owned out in the middle of nowhere, truly in the backwoods. He literally had neighbours nowhere to be found, and I found that quite interesting. Eventually he had to move out of there because it was too isolated, and living on his own, anything could have happened to him and he would have been miles away from help. I think it would have been quite hard to describe where his property was to anyone that needed to go there in case of emergencies, but I still have fond memories of being there. The property wasn't too big, but it was just enough, and the scenery was beautiful. Now where he lived, it actually had a really nice small lake next to it, and the water was always clear. The trees here were very big too, and very green during the summer, and I guess it was just a beautiful place to go generally. It could get extremely cold in the winter, but we wouldn't go there often during that time. Now, on one particular day, my mum and dad were going to take my grandfather out to have a nice meal and whatnot, and they would be gone for most of the day. That meant that I had to do some house sitting. I got some money out of it and I didn't mind, and I was just up for being out there on my own. I was getting to the age where I started to not enjoy living with my parents because I didn't want to be nagged all the time and constantly made to do different things. So I found the whole thing very nice. The main job I had was just to enjoy myself, and that's what I did. I arrived to the property and say my goodbyes to my grandfather and my mum and dad, and I watched the car slowly peel off with a slight dirt trail behind it. They tell me not to go outside very much because it could be dangerous, and I agree, but of course I didn't listen. So I head out and immediately I decide to go over to the lake. It was a really nice area that you could sit at, and you could even try some fishing, but I'd literally never caught anything, so I wasn't up for that today. I just took my shoes and socks off and let my feet dip into the water and would just twirl them around and relax. At this time of the year, the water wasn't actually that cold too, so it was another thing that I really liked. Now, I did this for a while and just took in all of the scenery. There was some cloud cover, but it wasn't enough that you couldn't get some sunlight on your skin that made you feel all nice and warm. So I was pretty content here. I stayed here for probably about a good hour or so before it started to look like it was gonna rain, and I decided that I should head back. Now, I head back, and while walking, there's some light rainfall which makes me increase my pace, but while walking, I can't get over how beautiful the place is. I didn't feel like I was trapped here. I kind of felt free and very privileged to be able to see everything like this. Now, I'm not too much further from home, and decided to stop. For whatever reason, I just had the feeling that I needed to be out for longer. So I head back the way I come, and luckily the clouds go and it's much more sunny now. I'm walking on this little path that's mostly usable, but there's some large rocks that I have to watch out for. There's one tree that's fallen up ahead of me, but it doesn't bother me, and I continue walking. I remembered thinking that I really wish I had my brother here or someone that could enjoy it and appreciate it like I did, but he was usually too busy with his girlfriend and he would quite often go off to do his own thing. I learnt later that he actually wanted to do more with me, but I didn't learn that at the time. So I was just here to enjoy it as much as I could. I was also learning to enjoy being on my own and not always need the company of others, but I did kind of miss it. I'd gone quite a long way. It was so much so that I actually become hungry again, and eventually I decided that I should loop back and just cut this to an end. Now I make my way back inside, and what do you know, I could not have timed it better. As soon as I get in and close the door behind me, I can now hear that it started to rain, and it was kind of nice because it made the whole experience very settling. Now, when I get inside, I do notice something odd. One of Grandma's dolls has been left out on the chair. I realise that my grandpa must have done this because it looks quite funny, but it's one that I hadn't realised was there before. It looks quite old and a little bit creepy, but I decide just to leave it there. I can put it away later, and I don't want to get in trouble for doing so right now. Now, I was pretty bored for the first couple of hours and actually drifted off asleep before waking up again. Now, while waking up, I realise that somebody's at the door. They haven't rang the doorbell or anything, but I can just see that somebody's standing there. They look pretty small, and I realise that it's probably a kid there, and I slowly make my way up. I then open the door thinking that it's one of my siblings that my parents have dropped here, and that maybe they've got to see me too, forgetting that I'd fell asleep for a while. I then realise that it's not a person, it's a doll. It's just standing propped up. I realise that it's on a stick and it's got some rocks keeping it in place, but it's just there like it's about to enter. I think this is extremely odd and take a step outside. I look around and can't see anybody, and quickly do a jog around the perimeter. That's when I realise it. There's about 10 doll heads all scattered around the outside of the property, and it gives me chills. I start worrying that my grandpa has something wrong with him that we haven't noticed, and I think, God, the isolation's probably really got to him, and maybe these are his friends, or he thinks they are, but that doesn't explain how the doll got there. I think maybe there's a rational explanation for this, so I just move it to the side with the other doll heads and go back inside. Now, I genuinely completely forgot about them being there, and don't ask me how, because in retrospect, this kind of creeps me out. But I just relax for a while and read a book and get lost in it until I get a call off my parents saying that they're gonna have to come over the next day, and how am I doing? I say that's fine, and they say there's some really bad traffic, so Grandpa's just gonna stay with them. And again, I've got no issues with this. Now, I eventually go about my evening and go to bed, and wake up the next morning. I really slept for a long time, because I wake up and my parents are pulling up on the driveway, and I run over and say hello, all excitedly. I ask how their day was, and they say it was pretty nice, just took them hours to get back home. And that's when my dad says, "What's that?" and spots it. I say, "I don't know. I didn't know Grandpa had this," and my grandpa gets out and is equally as confused, saying that he doesn't have any, and that's not Grandma's. I then say, come look, I thought it was really weird yesterday. I thought you did this, Grandpa, and originally I thought he was lying, but now, there's about 16 doll heads all around outside, randomly scattered throughout the property, and my grandpa looks a little bit confused and somewhat angry. At first he thought I'd scattered Grandma's around trying to scare them, but I say no, I haven't, and I quickly go inside and realise that all of my Grandma's 3 dolls are still there. That's when we realise something's really strange. Why are there doll heads here, and how long have they been there for? My grandpa says that he's certain that he didn't see them the other day when he was doing some yard work, so that poses a question. Who put them there and why? We search around the property and actually go quite far. I ended up going off closer to the lake again, trying to look for anything. Another doll or a person, but I can't find anyone. I eventually head back and my mum starts really panicking. I then explain that one of them was on the chair, and that's enough. My mum quickly gets all my stuff and my grandpa's stuff too that he needs, and she says that he's going to stay with us for a while. We quickly search around inside the property and can't see anything, and we lock up everything, and I watch the house slowly disappear in the distance. Now it took another good 3 or 4 months before eventually my grandpa went back there, and that was without incident. My dad had collected all of the doll heads into a trash bag and disposed of them. Turns out we never got to the bottom of what actually happened that day, and sometimes I still have nightmares about seeing those doll heads. Now, I've always been interested in the paranormal and unexplained ever since I was a young kid, after having what I now believe to be an experience with a black-eyed kid, but that's a story for another day. This one takes place when I was about 15 or so in the middle of Tennessee. Back then, I was going through my edgy phase, as we all do, and I thought it would be cool to go into the woods alone to blow off some steam, and why not? I spent a lot of time with my grandma as my dad worked 6 days a week, and I didn't feel comfortable being left alone at home since it was kind of a sketchy meth head town, whereas my grandma lived in a relatively nicer area. She owns a good few acres of land, and if you go far enough into the woods, there's this really beautiful waterfall that leads to an underground spring. So one day, I was going back there trekking the land I knew like the back of my hand at that point, enjoying the peacefulness and wilderness and everything it has to offer. After going uphill for a bit, it starts downhill and there's this clearing that takes you straight to the waterfall. Watching my feet as I walk, always cautious as to not step on a copperhead. I came down the hill into a clearing. Right at the bottom of the hill, I see something. It's unusual and catches my eye. It took me a second to realize what I was staring at, but it was the skeleton of a deer, like freshly killed. Now normally I wouldn't think too much of this, but something felt off. There was no rotten skin or signs of flesh anywhere. These bones still had flesh and blood on them, but no signs of skin or anything. My young teenage mind tried to process this, and I couldn't think of any predator in that area that could have just stripped a deer like this. The other thing is, no hunter would really be able to do this. Now, this is not an area where hunters are known to hunt to, or really supposed to be. The moment I realised this, a very strong sense of doom washes over me, and it's almost an impending one, and my fight or flight kicked in. It felt like the trees and everything around me was shaking, like something was moving fast towards me, so I took off and run as fast as I can, not even looking behind me, because I can sense I'm being chased. I hear the twigs and sticks breaking under the weight of something behind me. It sounds heavy too. I don't think I ever ran so quick in my life. Once I'm out of the woods, I make it back to roughly where my grandma's is, and get into the backyard, and suddenly a feeling of safety washes over me. I don't know what was in those woods that day, but needless to say, I didn't hike back there or go back there on my own ever again. In the late 90s, when I was about 12 years old, I went to a summer camp at Robbers Cave in Oklahoma. Our cabin was filled with bunk beds in big open space, so I had a top bunk. One of the nights I was there, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to a sound outside of my window. My head lay opposite from the window, so when I sat up, I was staring directly outside into the woods. Through the grass, I see a glowing green object in the shape of a person. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel it staring at me. The ordeal lasted for what felt like a minute of us staring at each other. I remembered I began feeling sick to my stomach, and the next thing I remember was waking up the following day. I've tried as rationally as I can to figure out what it was, or think maybe it was a dream, but it really felt different to me and was too vivid. The experience was so jarring that I've had recurring dreams about seeing this thing ever since, but for whatever reason, none of them feel like that first one that I had. Now, I grew up on a ranch. My dad owned a small single-wide trailer. We were neighbours with my tia and tio. They were around 100 yards to the left of us. The back of our trailer was placed really close to thick woods, so I didn't really have a backyard. We were kind of plopped right in the middle of the woods, but our driveway was connected to the main dirt road, if that makes sense. Well, I always felt creeped out about the backyard area and our back door. Like I said, we didn't have a backyard. It was a heavy, uncleared wooded area. We never used the back door. It was always locked with one of those chain locks on the inside. I was a very active kid. I couldn't ever sit inside and chill. I always had to be outside exploring. Usually my cousins and I would explore the ranch, build forts and ride four-wheelers, but there were times that I would go exploring alone. I remembered there was one time I was looking around the trailer alone trying to find a good spot to build a fort. I was around 8 years old at the time. I went to the end of the trailer to explore. This area had a large area of cleared brush, but behind me was a backwood area. Now I can remember walking around focusing on finding a good thought spot when suddenly I feel really uneasy. My attention immediately went to the backwood area. It felt like someone was staring at me. The feeling was so intense. I booked it to the back of my house. I don't remember any other details about that experience other than feeling like somebody was there staring at me. There was another time where I came home from my cousin's house to get some clothes since I was staying the night with her. So it's around 9 PM. My cousin's driveway connects to the main dirt road in the same area as my driveway. Anyway, when I open the front door and walk into the trailer, I noticed the back door was completely open again. I was staying at my cousin's house and my dad was down the road at a local bar. There was no one at the trailer for hours. My dad never opened the back door ever for any reason. I immediately felt very spooked and hightailed it back to my cousin's house without getting the clothes I initially went there to pick up. There's many other weird things that my cousins and I have experienced on the ranch, but this experience is by far the most alarming for us. It was during the summer of '07. We were at my cousin's house. My dad took us to Hollywood Video earlier that day to rent a movie. This was what he did to make up for being out late. Now, we ended up renting Texas Chainsaw Massacre and decided to watch it at about 1 AM. We chose to rent this movie and watched it at a time because we love to get spooked. Well, after finishing the movie, it's about 2 AM, and we still want to party, so we decide that we'll walk to my trailer and pick up the boombox and listen to our CDs we just burnt on a website. Remember, my cousin's driveway is connected to the main road parallel to where my driveway was. We get to walking, and out of nowhere, we hear a chainsaw going off in the hill about 40 or 50 yards to the left of us. Way too close for comfort. Again, this is 2 AM in the middle of nowhere. All of the land surrounding us is owned by a close family. None of them would ever opt to clear/operate a chainsaw at 2 AM in the pitch black. We actually have to use a flashlight to see the dirt road in front of us. That's how dark it was. When we heard the chainsaw, we all paused and looked at each other super confused. Once we processed what we're hearing, we run as fast as we can to my trailer, only because at that point, it was closer than my cousin's house. Unfortunately, my dad wasn't home. He was out doing whatever he was doing, so we couldn't tell him about what we just heard or ask for a ride back to the cousins. We ended up grabbing my loaded .22 and walking back with it in hand. Luckily, we didn't hear the chainsaw again. Now, to this day, my cousins and I are perplexed over this experience. There's no logical explanation to this chainsaw that we heard at 2 AM. In a weird way, it almost sounded like a very loud recording of a chainsaw, rather than an actual chainsaw. Again, none of my family would wake up at 2 AM and start clearing or doing anything, so it's weird. Or why would they play the sound of one for no reason? And I feel especially weirded out because we'd just watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Even though we were trying to get spooked, we didn't want it to be in this way. None of us are expecting what we heard. We all heard it clear as day at the same time. My cousins and I told our family about this experience on a few occasions. My family's response is always weird. My dad got short with us and said, well, you shouldn't have been out at that time. Now, I don't really know what to think of it. Now, My father grew up in rural Idaho in the 70s and 80s, and the ranch is surrounded by about 1,000 acres where he has no neighbors. Now one night, my grandparents left my father and his foster brother home alone while they attended an event in a larger city. Usually this is fine. The house is miles away from the road, so visitors were always expected and known in advance. It wasn't the sort of place that strangers happened upon. My dad was walking down the hall and happened to pass the back door, which has a large window directly next to it. He was horrified to see a man's face pressed against it and staring at him. He didn't recognize the man. Then he and the man actually stare at each other. Now, eventually the man moved away. My dad screams for his brother, and the both of them run upstairs to the front door. The front door is large and a sliding glass door that overlooks the driveway. In the driveway was an unfamiliar car with headlights on parked. Feeling trapped, they decide to call the closest neighbor they can think of. The neighbor agreed to come and check out the place, and they sat and watched the car park. And though they never saw anybody getting in or out of one, they watched the car that's there slowly drive and go away. Now, there are two bumpy dirt lanes that lead in and out of our ranch. One running north and the other south. They're both about a mile long. The neighbor that had seen the car had arrived from the south only a few minutes after the car pulled away, and the grandparents actually arrived from the north about the same time. Neither had passed the same car, or even seen a man walking around. In the years since, almost all my family has seen the car driving around the ranch, and few people have ever seen the man press his face against a window. Now, we have no idea who he is though. I grew up in a property that was really out of the way. It was literally like an hour drive just to find your next neighbor, and that had some advantages as well as some downsides. The problem was that if you didn't have a car, you're kind of stranded. And normally my parents would always have a babysitter whenever I was out, but at the time of this story, I was grown enough and trusted that yes, I could be in the property on my own if they needed to go out and do things. And I was a teenager, so I was more rebellious then. My father owned a rifle and I knew exactly where it was and how to open it with the key, so I always felt safe. Don't worry, I was trained by him and I knew all of the safety stuff, and I always thought of that if ever I went near that thing. Now on one particular day, my parents were going out for the evening. This was before cell phones, so I couldn't have called them if I needed to directly, but I knew that they had a landline that I could answer to, and I wasn't too worried really. They said that they're going to call around 10 at night just to check up on me before coming home at around 11. So I say goodbye, and I'm really happy here. It was kind of like one of those nostalgic summer days you remember when you're a kid, when you feel like you have all the time in the world to be at home and just do what you want. So I decided to go for a quick wander through the woods. I felt very happy, and I really enjoyed the fact that my parents were, yes, finally letting me do things as I wanted. It wasn't always as quick as I might have liked, but I didn't have a problem with it. I had some cool drinks with me as well that I'd bought from the store the other day with my dad. My dad said that I could treat myself and could also order pizza, so I was really happy. I had about $20 or so saved up, and I was looking forward to using it. Before my dad left, he told me that I could use his own money, so it made it even better. I ended up going through the woods for a while, and I didn't see anyone. I never did really. I wasn't even on a proper path, I just knew the area well, so enjoyed wandering around here. There was one kind of gate that you had to go through, which is owned by farmers, but there weren't any there at the time. I make my way down to the area that I like to sit at, which is near some abandoned railway tracks. Long ago the trains come here, and long ago were any other people. So that's why I'm a bit confused. As I'm laying down, I'm sure I can see something white just further up ahead. I didn't know what I was seeing. It kind of looked like when you see spots in your eyes and they glow too brightly, because I only saw it for a second but it disappeared. I thought that was pretty odd and actually ended up standing up and kind of covering my eyes to see as much as I can. You know how if you kind of make like binoculars with your hands you can focus a bit? I was doing that, but it didn't seem to make much of a difference because I couldn't see anything. I presume that yes, I'm not seeing anything and decide that I should just head back now. It was a given that I was putting on a front, but I was feeling a lot less confident than when I walked in here. Not to worry, I just played some of my favourite songs and headed out, jump over the gate and head back to home. Now I eventually get back in and I feel pretty happy and content. I go to raid the fridge of some of the cool drinks that I had and I have them all in one. I realise, this is a bad decision because I wanted to save some to have with the pizza, so I just put the TV on to distract myself. Now I had it on pretty loudly and that's when I don't notice it at first. There's some kind of knocking coming. I quickly get up and go towards the door. I think maybe my parents have come home early, so I open it and say, "Hey Dad," kind of annoyed, but I realise no one's around. I can just hear the sounds of the TV in the background, so I just think that maybe it was on the TV and close the door. I head back inside and turn down the TV a little bit and order the pizza. They inform me that there's problems with the line and that they can't understand what I'm saying to make the order, and I keep saying, "No, please, I just need one large chicken pizza," again and again until eventually they hang up on me. Annoyed, I hang up my phone too, actually slamming it down. Really irritated because I can make my own food, but who wants to do that? I think there's better things that I can be doing with my time, so I go back to watching TV. Still irritated with the pizza place, I put it on a little louder than before. Now I get lost in the show that I'm watching and kind of half fall asleep. I'm awoken again by knocking again, and I'm convinced that it's my parents at home. I quickly get up and peer around the window, but I can't see anyone or anything. Again, this is pretty bizarre, but I try not to get too bothered by it, and just look at the time quickly, thinking maybe my parents have gone round to close the window or something. That's when I realised that it's only been about 10 minutes and it's way too early for my parents to be back. I'm pretty tired now, but kind of orientate myself again and decide to turn off the TV. I decide that I'm going to do some reading of some of my comic books now because I've got all of the things at my disposal that I want to do. So I go and grab one, this time moving over to the kitchen. I start reading through them and I have a feeling that there's something on the back of my neck. I keep trying to reach for it, but I can't seem to figure out what it is. At first I thought maybe it was like a spider's web that had fell onto me or something like a hair, but I realise there's nothing there. And I also feel much more warm than earlier. Again, this is a pretty bizarre one and I can't really figure out what it is, and I just kind of hope that my mum and dad come back quicker. I go to the phone to try and make a phone call to my parents asking how long they're gonna be. So I pick up the phone and I realise that the line is down. I can just hear a constant buzzing sound. I actually disconnect and reconnect it and keep on picking it up and down, but it doesn't make a difference. The line is absolutely funked. I think, God, this can't get any worse. To be honest, I was going to reattempt to buy pizza afterwards too, so I was getting annoyed. I decide instead that I should go and make a sandwich now. I make it back to the kitchen and make myself a sandwich. I go back to watch some more TV, and you're probably getting tired of hearing this now, but it was one of my absolute favourite things to do. I'd love to say it was a big learning experience, but it wasn't. But hey, I was young, so it was a thing to do. Now, while watching TV this time, I noticed there's something, and it doesn't bother me at all at first. Don't ask me why, but I was probably too engrossed in what I was watching. I realise that there's a figure on the patio which doesn't look right. I can kind of just see it out of my eye until I turn around and we lock eyes. I'm now staring face to face with someone who is freakishly tall, dressed in a clown costume, holding a knife. I don't know what to do, and we're froze locking eyes for what feels like a good 20 seconds or so, but it was probably only about 2 or 3. I realise that I've dropped my sandwich as I was eating, and my limbs have all went limp. I go to scream, but nothing comes out of my mouth. For a second I considered that it was my parents and maybe they thought it was funny, but I realised it's not possible. This person is much taller than my dad. Now, to describe this person, they look like they're in their 50s or 60s, caked in clown makeup, wearing a typical clown uniform, mostly dressed in yellow. I go to scream again and nothing comes out when the clown slowly raises its hand up and starts waving back and forth to me. The clown then gestures to be quiet as it slowly walks round to the other side of the house out of sight, still clutching what I think is a knife. Now, I did scream finally, and I actually scared myself with the tone of it. Almost on instinct, I rush over to where the gun is stored. I go to grab the key, and I can't find it. I punched the side and actually hurt my hand, but somehow this opened it. I thank God under my breath and I quickly grab the rifle. My hands are shaking so much that I can't actually load it properly, and I ended up cutting my hand, which I'd already injured hitting this thing open, trying to put some ammo in. But that doesn't matter, I have lots of adrenaline now. I don't know where this clown is, and for some reason I decide the best thing I can do is open the window and start letting some shots off. Now, I could have very easily killed someone because I wasn't aiming, but I wasn't really thinking of that. I mean, God, I could have even hit my parents, but it's not worth thinking of. And I let out 4 shots outside the window. Now, this must have been enough to scare whoever that person is, because I go lurching window to window with my rifle in hand like some kind of spec ops soldier, and I don't see anyone. Now, I try again to call the police, call anyone, but the phone line's still down. I realise that all I can do now is just wait it out, and I quickly arm myself with all the ammo there is and go to the bathroom, locking the door. From here I have a point of view where I can see if my parents have come home or not. I just cock one in the chamber and wait there patiently. Now, my God, I thought it was about 6 hours, but it was probably only about 2. Before I eventually see some lights coming up the drive and I realise that it's my parents. I scream, "Mum, Dad, come." My dad quickly sprints out of the car and my mum's just behind them, and I rush to open the door of the bathroom and sprint down. I bolt there and my dad says, "Jesus, why have you got that?" and takes the gun off me, quickly putting a safety on. I then explain that somebody's here and my dad looks furious, flicks off the safety and goes room to room searching. He searches the entire house and even around the perimeter when he realises that somebody's cut the phone line. My mum is very scared and all of us get into the car, only once my dad is certain that no one's here. My dad's asking me to describe the person, and a look of absolute terror comes across him when I describe this person was wearing a clown outfit. I guess he had seen that killer from back in the day and maybe he thought it was someone inspired by them. I don't know, but eventually my dad gets over to the police station, screaming the whole time that he's gonna kill this person, he's gonna kill them. Eventually my dad puts the rifle down into the car because obviously he doesn't want to go into the police station like that, and we end up saying exactly what's happened. My mum's very shaken and we actually have to stay in a motel room for a number of months afterwards. My parents are not able to sell the property, but my mum also got a gun and I got my very own one after this. We were also never allowed to stay in there individually unless it was my dad on his own, but he never did that. We never found out who this is or what their intentions were, but unfortunately there wasn't enough forensics from where the line was cut. It's one experience that stayed with me and I think I'm never going to be able to lose it from my mind. I'm just incredibly grateful that I didn't freeze up, and God knows what would have happened to me if that had happened. Now, my grandma used to take me camping when I was a child. I did a girls' camp in the summer in the mountains when I was a preteen, where my friends and I would often wander off into the woods together. As a child, I played in the woods for hours with my brother. It was always fun and always felt safe and never eerie or creepy. Most of my time in the woods as a child was spent there, and it was fun and joyful and adventurous. I'd like to share another story, however, that I had a bad feeling from, and others dismissed us too, but when we were in our 20s, a friend of mine in DC organised a women survivalist training camp for our female friends, which is probably 7 or 8 of us, I can't remember exactly. No, I'd never been to West Virginia, but the land was beautiful and the roads were terrible. We had rented a cabin at a campground with multiple cabins on site, and during the day, now our guide and teacher would take us and show us cool things like local medicinal plants or how to make rope out of milkweed. A West Virginian extended family was having a large reunion at the same time. 2 to 3 of their girls, about elementary school age, start hovering around our classes. Now, they already knew most of what we're learning. We had a great time in the woods and on the land with no creepiness for the first night. However, on the last night, the owner of the campground had a big bonfire with hot dogs and marshmallows to roast and cider, and everybody who was renting a cabin was invited. It was after dark, and it was either a longish walk or a short drive, and this is on the campground land. So my friend A and I decided to walk. We were having a nice walk and a nice chat when we suddenly got a bad feeling. We both went quiet at the same time and were nonchalant, but glanced around to see what we could see. On our right was a cabin that looks deserted. It was totally dark, no lights on, no lantern out, but there was a single spot of light, the red embers of a cigarette burning. We could barely make out the figure of a man sitting there in the dark smoking. We stayed quiet but pick up the pace. We checked in with each other once we approached the big house, and we're finally in the light of the bonfire. Now that was creepy to us. Had we felt creepy before out there? No, calm and safe. The land hadn't ever felt creepy to us before, but the guy sitting in the dark had given a terrible menacing vibe, even 20 feet away before we saw him. We told some of our friends and they just laughed it off and told us that we'd been afraid for no reason. It was perfectly safe here, they said. He's just another camper, probably with the West Virginian family, and we're just paranoid, they say. Other than that, we had a great time at the bonfire, chatting with other campers and with the owners, who are very nice. When it came time to call it a night, the owners offered to drive us back, and A and I happily agreed. Now, wanting to avoid another walk by the terrible cabin, we got back safely without incident, and the owners wished us good night. Now, our cabin had 2 levels, the ground floor and a loft level. The ground floor was one big open room with a few beds, and if I recall correctly, a table and chairs and a fridge and maybe a stove. I was on the ground floor with the other 3 girls, and A was on the left level with the other 3 girls at the top. I often have insomnia, and I did that night, so I just stayed awake in the dark while everybody else fell asleep around me. I was awake for hours just thinking my thoughts until I heard the crunch of gravel outside, like somebody walking on it. I nudged my friend V, who was the closest person to me. I say to V there's someone outside, but V mumbled and said it's a deer and go back to sleep. So V's no help. I got out of bed and crawled over to the window to see if I could see a deer outside, crunching on gravel. I instead see the red glow of a cigarette and can barely make out the silhouette of 2 men in the darkness. Now, the 2 cabins are not close together. They weren't far, but they weren't close. We're on a bend of the camp road where the other cabins aren't. Now, the closest one was a short walk away, but it wasn't like running across the street or next door or anything, and not visible behind the trees and brush. Anyway, the closest cabin was far enough away that there was no other reason for two guys to be out there smoking. I nudge V and say there's two guys there, and she says it's a deer asleep. Now my boyfriend at the time had basically brought me all of REI to go on this trip. Our guide had asked us to bring a large knife, and had brought a nice hunting knife, and also a little camp hatchet. I don't know what I'd been able to do, to be honest, but I grabbed both, and just huddled to the window waiting in the dark. Suddenly, a car alarm goes off and all the cars were parked in the front of the house. Groans came, saying, "Come on, get the alarm off, who's that?" And I said, "I think it's mine," and found the fob and turned off the alarm. There's silence and we wait. The car alarm goes off again now. The girls lost it and say, "Shut up with your car." Now, I finally crawl to V. I say, "V, there are guys out there. I think they're messing with the car of the other girl." And she says, "It's a deer. Go to bed and leave me alone." Okay, then the car alarm goes off again, and they shout at her to turn off the car alarm. Now, A eventually comes down the little ladder thing. I went up to her and whisper, "Hey, there's two guys out there, and no one believes me. They're just saying it's a deer. But I saw them smoking in the back. You can't go out there alone. I'm going out there first with the lantern so at least we can see around the cabin." So we put the shoes on and I turned on the lantern and opened the door and walked onto the porch with the lantern in my left hand and hatchet in my right. I hung up the lantern on a little hook on the porch. It was very bright and lit up the whole clearing in front of the cabin and the whole parking lot for the cars. For at least a moment we can't see anyone there. I tentatively walked towards the front door and walked around the car, trying the handles. No alarm went off as she tugs them. "See, it wasn't a deer," I said. "Even with you trying to get into the car while it was locked, no alarm. Your alarm's not sensitive, someone's trying to get in." We go back into the house and lock the door behind us, turning off the lantern, and sat inside the dark waiting for our eyes to adjust. A told me that she hadn't been able to sleep well and had been lying awake in the dark in the loft, feeling uneasy. I told her I wondered if somebody had tried to lure her out there alone in the dark and had been spooked off when the two of us came in with an extremely bright lantern. We then stay there, quietly chatting together in the dark for hours, waiting to see if anything else would happen, but the alarm doesn't go off again, and finally, enough time's passed that we decide to go to bed. The car alarm was quiet for the rest of the night. That was our last night there, so in the morning we pack up and I drove back with A. Now, if a zombie apocalypse were to happen, I pick A for my team because she was listening to her gut and worked with me as a team to keep everyone safe. I'll keep this short and sweet, but this happened a few years back. We're having a brutally cold winter. The snow had frozen into ice and covered everything. It was pitch black in the backyard, and when I went to let my dogs outside one last time before bed that evening, as we exited the house from the sliding door for the walkout basement and onto the lower deck, I felt that something's off. Our house backs up onto some woods, so I was accustomed to hearing noises from wildlife in the night time, but this is different. Nothing made a sound except the Arctic cold wind, but I had a feeling that I'm being watched. The entire time my dog was in the backyard. I looked around nervously, expecting a coyote or some other kind of predator to pop out of the tree line. My dog does his business, but afterwards stopped and stared to the corner of the woods until I actually get scared and call him back inside. He hurries back. I quickly lock the sliding door and shut the curtains, unable to shake the uneasy feeling of which I'm having now. After double and triple checking all the locks in the house, I go to bed. Around 3 in the morning, I now hear the muffled sound of my dog barking from the basement 2 floors below. I got up, stumbled down 3 flights of stairs, and found him standing in the basement. He was peeking his head through the closed curtains, barking his head off with the hair standing up all along his back. Now, I try calling him away from the door, but he won't let up, which is weird. I dreaded peeking out the curtain to see what he's barking at after the uneasy feeling I had earlier in the night. Finally, I hold my breath and swipe the curtains aside. I peer into the inky blackness but see nothing to cause alarm, and a wave of relief washes over me. Now I figured that it must have been a deer or raccoon in the yard that set him off. He whined at the door for a few more minutes until I bribed him upstairs with a cookie for dogs. I went back to bed and wasn't disturbed again. That is, until the morning when I went into the basement to let the dog out. I opened the sliding door and walked out onto the deck as he bounded into the snow. My blood ran cold as the sub-zero morning temperatures pierced when I looked down. But there, frozen into the deck, were a set of bare human footprints which are very clear. I can make out each toe on the person's footprint. The prints were large and appeared to be from an adult male. Looking around, I noticed that they started at the deck, went to the sliding door, then towards the basement living room, then disappearing off the side of the deck. I had my snow boots on, so I walked around but couldn't find any other trace of the footprints. Keep in mind, the daily temperatures are around 0, never above it, and the wind chill made it feel close to 20 below. Frostbite would have literally set in within a matter of minutes for anybody out there, especially in the dead of night. Now, I've never experienced anything like it since. My father is a park ranger, and even when he was off duty, he still liked to take me on trips out into the great wilderness. We went to quite a few different national parks, but something that I'd like to share with you is a rather strange experience that we had while we went on one camping trip during the summer. Now, we were planning to be out here for about 4 days, and this is during the summer break. It meant that a lot of different places were very busy, but my father, having the career that he did, knew one that would be a very quiet place we could go to, and I was all up for it. At the time, I was doing okay in school, but I didn't really know what I wanted really. At the time, I was pretty sure I was going to end up in the military, but it didn't happen for a few reasons. But because of this at the time, my dad thought it would be a good idea to take me out into the woods just to get accustomed to being outside. It made a lot of sense, and obviously you're going to spend time camping out if you're in the military, so it was a pretty good idea, we thought. I did have some summer school things that I needed to do which were coming up, and I really didn't want to do them. I don't know, the idea of summer school just never really made sense to me. The way that I'd look at it is that you're on summer vacation for a reason, and you shouldn't have to do more things in between. I think it should be a time that you can really rest and recover, but my mum didn't think so. Again, I think my dad understood this, and that's why he was quite willing to take me on a nice trip I could enjoy. There's a number of different things we had planned for this particular trip. Now, on the first day we set out just for a nice hike to see the views. We had all of our camping gear with us in some old military rucksack things, my dad carrying the most. Now, during the first day, we saw a couple of people around, but I realised that the further we went, the less and less they would become. Now, this is a good thing for me because I kind of wanted to escape people a bit. It was a really good experience, and I had a good time bonding with my father over this. Now, eventually it gets closer to nightfall, and we decide that we're going to try some night fishing. It's something that I haven't done before, so I'm quite excited to do so. We eventually make it to the campground that my dad had picked out for us, so I'm pretty happy to be there and put the stuff down. My dad shows me where we can do the fishing and sets up everything and gives me a headlamp. Now, while this is happening, I haven't really done fishing before, so I'm pretty much at a loss as to how exactly I'm supposed to do this, so every 5 minutes that I haven't caught anything, I put my headlamp closer to the water looking for the fish, obviously scaring them off, and I constantly move my fishing reel around thinking that's going to make a difference, but again, it probably just scares them off. I don't know. I was more worried about hurting my hand on the fishing reel. My dad seems to be gone for quite a while though, but it doesn't really bother me at the time because I'm too caught up in trying to do the fishing. While fishing, I can hear some water disturbance. It's not close, but I definitely notice it, and I face my head up, trying to shine my lamp towards it, but obviously I can't see that far. The torch isn't that powerful. Now I can just about make out the silhouette of something in the water before it disappears down again, and I think, wow, that must have been a really big fish. Now, something strange that happened while doing so is, out of my peripheral vision, I realised that a plant has just moved, like somebody's gone over and touched it. Now again, there's no one around but myself and my dad, and I know it's not my dad, so I'm a little bit unsettled by this. Now, I do think maybe it was just some kind of animal, so I don't think too much of it. I try and cast my fishing reel as far out as I can now. I just about do so, and my dad eventually arrives and says, "Godson, you know you took me out with that. You have to be careful," and shows me how to do it properly. And my dad's actually doing fishing properly. We didn't eventually find anything, but he tells me not to shine the light down because it scares the fish and that you kind of want to stay still. I tell him that I'm sure there was a large fish that disturbed the waters further up, but he tells me the fish shouldn't be big enough to really do that, because I said it was similar to a person, but I think my dad dismisses this. Now it starts to get quite cold, so we head back to our campsite and settle in for the night. And it's a pretty good night. My dad was reading a book and I wasn't really sure what to do with myself, so I just started drawing some things. It's something I'd done when I was a lot younger. I don't actually do drawing anymore, but I'm pretty good at kind of like the cartoon sketches for some reason. I guess I used to draw The Simpsons and SpongeBob or something like that, but I think that's the reason that I have kind of a knack for it. And my dad was pretty impressed with my drawings. I just drew some of the forest and tried to draw the thing that I'd seen in the water earlier. Well, not necessarily the thing, but the way the water was disturbed and the plant moving. It felt like the right thing to do at the time. And that was that. We eventually fall asleep and wake up for the next day. Now on the second day, we weren't actually leaving this spot, and we were just going to do some more hiking around. My dad took me to one place, and my god did it have a beautiful view there. Everything looked so pristine and beautiful, and at the time it cemented into my mind that I wanted to be a military person, because I thought, well, I'm just going to be seeing things like this all the time, and for that I was incredibly excited. Now my grandfather and his grandfather are in the military. We're kind of from a military family, so I thought it was going to be good to follow suit. Now, eventually this day comes to a close and nothing too much happened. The following morning we pack up and we're ready to go on to the last part of this, get into the last campsite, the third one. Now the hiking to get to this one wasn't too bad really. And again, I was pretty pleased to go out there. I don't know why, I just felt good the whole time, and it was a lovely experience. Now we get to the campground eventually and settle in for the night. And this is when things get a bit weird. I'm awoken by the sight of somebody outside the tent. I can just about see the silhouette. I say, "Dad," and then realise he's not there, and I quickly unzip the tent. I can see my dad holding the hunting knife and torch in the other, pointing at someone. I say, "Dad, Dad," and he says, "To stay still, son," and my dad screams at somebody to get back now. Because of how bright it is, and obviously I've just come out of the dark tent, my eyes haven't adjusted, but I quickly go and grab my headlamp and turn that on, and I can see somebody covered in blood there holding a knife, just staring at me and my dad. Now, what was really crazy is what happened next. He turns round, throws himself into a tree, then gets up again and repeats the process. He stares at us for probably 10 seconds before going up to the exact same tree near our campsite, throwing himself at it, then coming back again. I realise that he's dropped a knife and constantly picks it up, and he hasn't cut himself, and the blood and stuff is just from the tree. But what on earth is he doing? Now this gone on for a good 10 minutes before my dad tells me to start packing up everything. I quickly do so, and I didn't feel too scared in this moment because having my dad there with his knife made me feel like the safest person in the world. Now, we eventually get all of our stuff together, and I kid you not, the whole time this guy was constantly doing this same thing over and over again. I've never seen anything like it, and not even to this day I haven't. We eventually get our stuff together, and my dad tells me to hold his hand and to lead the way back. Now this is a big responsibility at the time because I haven't really been camping like this before, and I'm not certain I know the way back, but my dad tells me that he's not going to look back until this guy's out of sight. Now I do constantly glance back, and my dad tells me not to because he can see when I'm doing it because of the light, and he knows how scared I can get sometimes. But I asked my dad what's happening, and he said that the guy's constantly doing this same thing over and over again, until eventually we're at a point where my dad can take over and tells me to do the same. My dad's walking incredibly quick, and eventually we make it back. My dad quickly makes a call to the police and reports what's happening. I'm confused as heck, and eventually we get back into the car and drive home. Now it turns out that what happened, and this is something I only learned after my dad told me after a number of years, is that the police found that guy there. Apparently, he had stabbed somebody and then taken some kind of mushroom that gives you a repetitive motion syndrome or whatever it's called. And that's why he was throwing himself at the tree. Apparently he was completely out of his mind, but they managed to capture him. Now if it wasn't for that mushroom making him repeat his motions, he could have easily continued to progress towards us and probably just stabbed us in our tent. But thank God he didn't. In 2020, my mum, 60s female, and I, 30s female, decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app and we went off. When we got there, we realised it's right off the highway, but there were enough trees and a fence up that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place with no locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched a tent pretty far back close to the woods on the property. The closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards. But then again, it was mostly fenced in and surrounded by firs. It's a lovely campsite, and my mum raved about how beautiful the place was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property, but we arrived late, and I didn't know we'd be able to get a new spot quickly. My mum could tell I was nervous, but for some reason I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I keep an eye out and didn't see or hear anything too odd. IRC. My mum went to bed before I did and stayed up and watches the fire for a long time before going to bed. Finally, I tuck in very exhausted from staying up. At about 2 AM, I awoke to twig snapping and what sounded like somebody dragging their fingers on the side of the tent. Up to the front, I sat up, grabbed the phone and the only weapon I had, a flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I need to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if a tree branch shadow was moving from the wind. It sounded like there's two people outside trying their best to be quiet. We had brought our books and boots inside and there was no indicator of anybody being out there. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent that I was in while listening for what they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew somebody inside was alert, but no more than that. If they knew someone is awake, they can't surprise us, but they also don't know who is inside or whether we have guns or not. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mum slept through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup had been in the cup holder which was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground now. My mum raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up and I didn't tell her, but let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods? Someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night, or God knows who? My mum got a great experience and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said that they might actually set up cameras now just to keep an eye on things for the future. Now it's really the people out there that scare me more than anything. I don't like the way that they're acting so misconspicuously and trying their best not to be heard. That's what creeps me out, and why would they go through our stuff? Now I work as a childcare professional, and one of the kids that I look after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him into a really cool trail in the Salt Fork State Park. We were all set up to hike to the Hoss Cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entire trail was about half a mile, which is why I say I chose the trail for our hike that day. I also chose this trail because any time that I'd been on it before, it was busy and full of people and a very popular site, which makes me feel very secure. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of 7 summer storms which causes massive damage to the trail, so to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that was just barely visible from the trailhead. He was still up for the hike, despite the entire width of the trail being washed out until it was no more than a foot or so wide, with a 6 foot to 12 foot drop off into a creek bed. There's then a solid rock and several miles of trees. Now he's very athletic, and I was confident in his abilities and he was so excited to tackle our adventure. We made it all the way to the platform that allows you to see the entire cave. Now there's many trees which are surrounding the platform, and it was actually closed at this point, but we made it this far and we decided to maneuver around the platform and proceed a few hundred feet into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to difficulty, so I knew exactly what it looks like. There were tree roots directly under the platform and you could climb down on either side of them. It's also worth noting that the cave is much more like a cliff with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of water directly in the middle. It's not a creepy closed up cave, it's very open and beautiful. We got to the cave and I noticed a candle that was not burning recently, but had been at some point sitting on a large rock and had a heart caved into it. I chalked it up to somebody having a date or something and disregarding it. He wanted to climb to the top when I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by someone. It definitely felt weird at this point, but it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and wanted to catch them. It was the happiest that I've seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that we have to go. We spent about an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. We finally decided to leave, and when we got to the platform, dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth hanging in there, which was absolutely not there before. He noticed it as well, but didn't pick up on the severity of the situation of which we're in. At that moment, I actually knew two things. One, someone's watching us, and we didn't see them. And two, they were potentially hiding in the woods and made a point to not be seen, but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back with the narrow trail, and I was not about to tell him that we're in potential danger. I told him to go out in front of me, and I just encouraged him basically, and say we're doing great, over and over, and that speeds him up naturally. I never saw anyone until we were on the trail. We got to the car and I locked the doors immediately. On our way out of the park, a very dirty man, probably in his 30s, came out of the woods and just stares at me, absolutely void of emotions. That man completely follows me until I'm out of sight with his eyes, literally like a serial killer stare. Now, I knew the third fact at that point, that he made a point to make himself apparent, and that's the one that kind of scares me the most. That stare actually stuck with me for days, and I considered cancelling after that as it bothered me for several weeks, causing anxiety. I tried to tell myself that maybe we interrupted his bath time and he didn't want to startle us. After all, he could have just been out there and watching us catching salamanders waiting to go. But I just cannot rationalise why he stared at me like that and wouldn't move. Deep down I know that it was probably a deliberate scare tactic or something. He never had any idea how panicked I was though, my boyfriend. It was the most fun that I've ever seen him have. He brings it up on a regular basis as a very positive experience, but for me, it was not good and I feel very disturbed.